If the South Had Won. The American Civil War's alternate ending, written by Marcus Drayson, narrated by Gloria Feathers. Chapter 1: The War's New Path. The outcome of the Civil War changed dramatically in this alternate history, with the South emerging victorious. The Confederacy's early victories redefined the course of the conflict and set the stage for a dramatically different future. One of the key factors in the South's triumph was the strategic advantage gained in the opening years of the war. With superior military leadership, especially from General Robert E. Lee, the Confederacy was able to exploit the Union's weaknesses and win crucial battles that would eventually shift the momentum in their favor. The Battle of Gettysburg, for instance, saw Confederate forces turning the tide of battle in their favor. With the Union forces retreating, the South captured key northern territories, including Washington, D.C., which became a symbol of Confederate dominance. The impact of foreign intervention was another pivotal factor in the war's new direction. European powers, particularly Great Britain and France, had long been sympathetic to the Southern cause due to economic interests, primarily the cotton trade. With the Union struggling, European nations were more inclined to recognize the Confederacy, and this recognition provided them with military and financial support. In this alternate timeline, the Confederacy was not only able to win vital battles, but also secure crucial international recognition, which solidified its independence. A key turning point in this reimagined history occurred when the South succeeded in capturing Washington, D.C. After several key victories, the Union's capital fell into Confederate hands. This was a symbolic and strategic blow to the Union cause. Without the political and military heart of the nation, the North was thrown into disarray. President Abraham Lincoln, unable to maintain control, was forced to negotiate a peace settlement. The Confederate States of America, led by President Jefferson Davis, could now dictate the terms of the peace and its future. At the same time, the Union's government fractured. With Washington, D.C. under Confederate control and key northern states considering secession themselves, the once unified United States faced the very real possibility of permanent division. Northern politicians, reeling from their losses, could not agree on a cohesive strategy for continuing the war or negotiating peace, further complicating the North's ability to effectively fight back. The new path the war had taken led to a restructured political landscape where the Confederacy was no longer seen as a rebellion, but as a legitimate nation. What followed was the formal recognition of Southern independence, with long-term consequences for both American societies and international politics. The South's early victories. The initial phase of the Civil War was marked by a series of unexpected victories for the South, which gave the Confederacy a significant edge over the Union in the opening years of the conflict. These early successes were largely due to the superior leadership of Confederate generals, most notably General Robert E. Lee, whose military brilliance quickly became apparent. In battles like First Bull Run and Fredericksburg, the South was able to capitalize on its home field advantage and the tactical expertise of its commanders, forcing the Union forces to retreat and rethink their strategies. One of the most significant victories came at the Battle of Bull Run, where Confederate forces, led by General Thomas Stonewall Jackson, defeated Union troops and shattered the North's belief in a swift victory. This early Confederate triumph provided a morale boost for the South and demonstrated that the Union could not win the war as easily as they had hoped. The South's ability to hold its ground against the more numerous Union forces signaled to both domestic and international audiences that the Confederacy was not only capable of defending itself, but also had the potential to defeat the Union in key engagements. The Battle of Fredericksburg in December 1862 was another pivotal moment, where Confederate forces once again outmaneuvered the Union and secured a crushing victory. The Union's disastrous frontal assault against fortified Confederate positions showcased the limitations of Union tactics and exposed the South's ability to capitalize on the terrain. The Union's failure at Fredericksburg further weakened Northern resolve, while Confederate morale soared, giving the South renewed confidence in its ability to win the war. In addition to battlefield successes, the Confederacy's early victories had significant political and diplomatic ramifications. The South's military achievements caught the attention of European powers, particularly Great Britain and France, which had economic interests tied to Southern cotton. These victories made it more likely that European nations would recognize the Confederacy as a legitimate nation-state, potentially leading to crucial foreign support that could tip the balance of the war in favor of the South. The early victories of the South established a strong foundation for the Confederacy, one that would shape the direction of the war. They demonstrated that the South was a formidable military power, capable of holding its own against the Union and possibly securing its independence. As the war continued, these initial successes would prove to be vital in ensuring the Confederacy's survival, at least in the early stages of the conflict. Key turning points. In this alternate history, the key turning points of the Civil War are reversed, with the South managing to capitalize on moments that in our timeline would have tipped the balance in favor of the Union. One of the most pivotal reversals comes with the Battle of Gettysburg, traditionally seen as the high watermark of the Confederacy. In this alternate timeline, Lee's Army of Northern Virginia achieves a decisive victory, pushing back Union forces and securing not only the battlefield, but a crucial psychological advantage. With the Union Army in retreat, the Confederacy's position becomes significantly stronger, both on the ground and in the eyes of the world. This victory at Gettysburg allows the Confederacy to advance into Pennsylvania and threaten northern cities, including Philadelphia and even Washington, D.C. The fall of the Union capital, a devastating blow, would demoralize the northern population and force President Lincoln to reconsider his approach to the war. Rather than rallying the North to continue the fight, as happened in our history, the fall of Washington leads to political upheaval in the Union. With Northern resolve crumbling, Northern leaders are now much more open to diplomatic negotiations, ultimately leading to a peace settlement that grants the South its independence. The reversed outcome of Gettysburg is not the only significant shift in the war's course. The Union's failure to deliver a decisive blow at Antietam and the subsequent missed opportunity to issue the Emancipation Proclamation emboldens the Confederacy further. Without the proclamation, which in our timeline shifted international sympathy toward the Union cause, European powers like Great Britain and France remain neutral, if not sympathetic, to the Confederacy. This allows the South to gain crucial diplomatic recognition, solidifying its standing as an independent nation in the eyes of the international community. In another critical reversal, the Union's failure to break the siege at Vicksburg allows the Confederacy to maintain control of the Mississippi River. With this key strategic advantage intact, the South is able to secure its western frontier and prevent the Union from dividing the Confederacy in two. By holding the river, the South ensures its ability to move troops and supplies freely, effectively outlasting the Union's blockade and maintaining its war effort with a renewed sense of confidence. These key turning points, when reversed, create a cascading effect that shifts the trajectory of the war. The Confederacy, with its military and diplomatic successes, positions itself to not only survive, but ultimately thrive as an independent nation, forever changing the course of American history. The impact of foreign intervention. In this alternate history, foreign intervention plays a critical role in ensuring the success of the Confederacy during the Civil War. Historically, European powers like Great Britain and France remained largely neutral despite their economic interests in Southern cotton. However, the South's early military victories and strategic successes, combined with growing pressure from the cotton trade, shift European attitudes, and these powers decide to intervene, tipping the balance of the conflict in favor of the Confederacy. The British, in particular, have long-standing economic ties to the South, reliant on Southern cotton to fuel their textile mills. As the Union struggles and key Confederate victories mount, the British government begins to see an opportunity in backing the Confederacy. By recognizing the Confederate States of America as a legitimate nation, Britain opens the door to formal diplomatic relations and trade agreements, providing crucial support to the Southern cause. With British backing, the South is not only able to secure vital resources, but also gain international legitimacy, which significantly weakens the Union's position. France, under Emperor Napoleon III, sees an opportunity to expand its influence in the Western Hemisphere. France, always a rival of British power, supports the Confederacy diplomatically and even militarily. French support comes in the form of providing arms, funding, and potentially even troops. This foreign assistance helps the Confederacy maintain its war effort, making it far more difficult for the Union to succeed in its blockade and strategic campaigns. With the Confederacy able to bypass the Union's naval blockade, it gains access to international markets and military supplies that strengthen its military position. This foreign intervention has a significant impact on the war's progression. Not only does it provide the Confederacy with much-needed supplies and resources, but it also shifts the global balance of power. The Union, isolated both diplomatically and economically, becomes increasingly unable to maintain its fight against a Confederacy that now enjoys the backing of two major European powers. The Union is forced to reconsider its military strategies and ultimately its approach to the war. The Confederacy's ability to gain international recognition and support changes the nature of the conflict. The South is no longer seen as a rebellious faction, but as a legitimate and sovereign nation. With the Union increasingly isolated on the global stage, the path to Southern independence becomes clearer, and the South's prospects for victory are significantly enhanced. Foreign intervention ultimately becomes one of the most decisive factors in the Confederacy's success, altering the course of American history forever. Chapter 2: The Secession Solidified. With the South securing early victories and gaining international recognition, the idea of secession becomes not just a regional desire, but an undeniable reality. The Confederacy's newfound strength emboldens Southern leaders and allows them to take decisive steps in solidifying their independence from the Union. As military success continues and diplomatic ties with European powers like Great Britain and France flourish, the Confederacy moves toward formalizing its position as a separate, sovereign nation. The Confederacy's independence is now unquestioned, and the Southern states become more unified in their resolve. In Washington, D.C., the Union government, weakened by battlefield losses and internal divisions, begins to realize that further military action will be futile without significant support from both the North and abroad. The Union's inability to maintain a cohesive strategy or regain lost territory forces many Northern leaders to reconsider their stance on the war. As Northern states feel the economic and social pressures of prolonged conflict, some begin to negotiate for peace, seeking to avoid further bloodshed and potential collapse. With the Confederacy firmly entrenched and the South's desire for independence strengthened, the Southern states moved to create a more permanent and effective government. The Confederate Constitution, which had been drafted in the early stages of the war, becomes the guiding framework for this new nation. It enshrines the right to slavery as a cornerstone of the Southern economy and way of life, while also establishing a government structure that reflects Southern values of states' rights and limited federal power. The Confederacy solidifies its military, political, and economic institutions, ensuring its long-term survival as an independent entity. Southern leaders, including President Jefferson Davis, are able to consolidate power and create a more centralized government that can withstand both internal and external challenges. The victory at Gettysburg and the continued success on the battlefield further solidified their legitimacy. With Confederate independence officially recognized by foreign powers, the South is free to pursue its own course without the interference of Northern interests. Meanwhile, the Union's internal struggles grow. The Northern economy falters as trade routes are disrupted and resources are drained by an ongoing war. Political factions within the North become more vocal in their calls for a negotiated peace, leading to the eventual collapse of Union resolve. The Confederacy, meanwhile, strengthens its position both diplomatically and militarily, ensuring that the secession is no longer seen as an act of rebellion, but as the birth of a new nation. The South's secession, once a fragile hope, is now a concrete and enduring reality. Southern independence recognized. With the South's early military successes and the shifting tides of international diplomacy, the Confederacy's claim to independence becomes more than just a regional aspiration. It is recognized globally as a new, sovereign nation. The formal recognition of Southern independence by European powers, particularly Great Britain and France, marks a significant turning point in the war. In our alternate history, these nations, driven by economic interests and the desire to weaken the United States, officially acknowledge the Confederacy, which not only strengthens its position, but also shifts the global balance of power. For the South, recognition from Britain and France is a momentous achievement. The Confederacy, once seen as a rebellious faction of the Union, now stands as a legitimate nation on the world stage. Diplomatic relations with European powers are swiftly established, and Southern cotton once again finds its way into European markets, providing vital economic support to the fledgling nation. This trade relationship, bolstered by the South's victory in key battles, ensures that the Confederacy can sustain its war effort and continue to build its infrastructure and economy without the crippling effects of a Union blockade. The recognition also provides the Confederacy with a sense of security on the international front. With Britain and France now aligned with the South, any potential Union attempt to regain control over the Confederacy faces the serious obstacle of foreign intervention. In this alternate timeline, the Confederacy's military successes are seen not just as victories on the battlefield, but as steps towards solidifying a new world order in which Southern independence is unquestioned. The South, in turn, leverages these international alliances to secure weapons, financial aid, and military advisors, strengthening its defense and bolstering its chances of victory. For the Union, the international recognition of the Confederacy is a crushing blow. Once confident in its ability to defeat the South and preserve the Union, Northern leaders now face the stark reality that they are not only fighting a prolonged civil war, but also battling against the diplomatic weight of European powers. With the South now recognized as an independent nation, the Union's efforts to reassert control seem increasingly futile. The growing pressure from European nations to end the war peacefully amplifies the divisions within the North, leading many to question the viability of continuing the fight. The recognition of Southern independence seals the Confederacy's future, ensuring that the South will never again be part of the United States. With a new government firmly in place and international legitimacy achieved, the Confederacy is free to chart its own course, forever altering the trajectory of American history. The reaction of Northern states, the recognition of Southern independence, and the subsequent collapse of the Union's efforts to regain control triggers a complex and varied reaction across Northern states. While some factions continue to call for the war to be pushed forward at all costs, others begin to seriously question the feasibility of continuing the conflict. The Union's loss of key battles, the failure to secure decisive victories, and the growing pressure from foreign powers to negotiate a peace settlement all contribute to a weakening resolve in the North. In the immediate aftermath of the South's recognition, the Northern political landscape becomes increasingly fractured. Many states, particularly those with strong economic ties to the South, begin to feel the economic ramifications of the war's stalemate. Northern industries that depended on Southern cotton for textile manufacturing are now facing severe disruptions. This economic hardship drives more moderates and even some Republicans to reconsider their stance on the war. Business leaders and local politicians in key northern states start to push for peace talks, arguing that the costs of continued conflict are too high, both in terms of human lives and economic damage. Social unrest also increases in the North as working-class families and soldiers begin to question the war's worth. The draft, which had already been a source of tension, becomes even more unpopular as the Northern public grows disillusioned with the Union's inability to win a quick victory. In cities like New York and Boston, protests erupt and calls for an end to the war become louder. These protests reflect a deepening divide between the political elite, who still hold out hope for victory, and the common people, who are increasingly weary of the prolonged conflict. Additionally, some northern states with large populations of immigrants or populations sympathetic to the Southern cause begin to voice support for the Confederacy. Their desire to see the war end is fueled by a belief that the Union's goal of preserving the nation at all costs is no longer worth the sacrifice. States like Ohio, Illinois, and Pennsylvania, once staunch supporters of the Union, now see internal divisions that threaten the cohesion of their state governments. As Confederate independence is solidified, Northern leaders must contend with the reality that their ability to reassert control over the South has become almost impossible. These internal divisions force President Lincoln and other Union leaders to seek negotiations, ultimately leading to a peace agreement that formally recognizes the Confederacy's independence. The Union, fragmented and exhausted, has no choice but to accept the South's permanent secession, marking a turning point in the nation's history. The reaction from Northern states, once hopeful of a swift Union victory, now reflects the disillusionment and pragmatism that accompany the collapse of their national aspirations. The creation of the Confederate Constitution. The creation of the Confederate Constitution was a defining moment in the establishment of the Confederate States of America. As the Southern states moved toward formal secession from the Union, it became clear that they needed a framework that would not only solidify their independence, but also ensure the stability of their new government. Drawing heavily on the U.S. Constitution, the Confederate Constitution reflected many of the same principles, but with key modifications that aligned with the Confederacy's values and priorities, especially in regard to slavery and states' rights. One of the most notable features of the Confederate Constitution was its explicit protection of slavery. While the U.S. Constitution had been silent on the issue, the Confederate Constitution enshrined slavery as a fundamental right, explicitly stating that no law shall be made which shall impair the right of property in slaves. This reflected the central role that slavery played in the Southern economy and way of life. The Confederacy's founders saw it as vital to their economic survival, and they took great care in ensuring its legal protection. Additionally, the document prohibited the Confederacy from ever abolishing slavery, solidifying it as a permanent institution within the Southern states. Another key element of the Confederate Constitution was the emphasis on states' rights. The document severely limited the power of the central government, reflecting the South's desire to avoid the perceived overreach of the federal government that had led to secession in the first place. The Confederate Constitution granted individual states more authority to govern themselves and make decisions about issues like taxation, internal improvements, and the establishment of local militias. This decentralized approach was in direct contrast to the more centralized federal system of the United States, where the federal government held more power over the states. The Confederate Constitution also created a presidency with strong executive powers, though it was still more limited than the powers granted to the president under the U.S. Constitution. The President of the Confederacy, like that of the United States, was to serve a single 6-year term with no possibility of re-election. Jefferson Davis, a former U.S. Senator and Secretary of War, was elected the first president of the Confederacy, and his leadership became integral to the South's war efforts. The Confederate Constitution marked the formalization of a new government based on principles of limited central authority, the protection of slavery, and the sovereignty of individual states. While it shared many similarities with the U.S. Constitution, its differences reflected the fundamental ideological divide between the Confederacy and the Union. This Constitution would serve as the guiding document for the Confederacy until its collapse, symbolizing the South's commitment to its vision of a separate and independent nation. Chapter 3: The Battle for the Capitol. The Battle for the Capitol was a decisive moment in the Civil War's alternate timeline, one that would have profound implications for both the Union and the Confederacy. As the war progressed, Washington, D.C., which was the symbol of Union power, became an even more significant target for Confederate forces. The South, emboldened by early victories and the recognition of its independence by European powers, began to believe that taking the Union capital was not just a symbolically important goal, but a strategic necessity for securing the Confederacy's survival. In this alternate history, the Confederacy, led by General Robert E. Lee, quickly adapted to the changing nature of the war. After victories at places like Gettysburg and Fredericksburg, the South gained momentum, and its military strategy shifted from a defensive posture to one of aggression. With the Union capital still under threat, Lee made a bold decision to push deeper into Northern territory, taking advantage of the North's disarray and lack of coordination. The Union, meanwhile, struggled to regroup and mount an effective defense. Despite the best efforts of President Abraham Lincoln and his generals, Northern forces were unable to stop the Confederate advance. The fall of major cities like Philadelphia and Baltimore further weakened Northern morale, making the defense of Washington, D.C. even more difficult. Northern political leaders were torn between maintaining a prolonged fight and negotiating a peace settlement with the Confederacy. The division in the Union was now mirrored on the battlefield, where Northern forces failed to unite under a common purpose. The Union's leadership, still reeling from past defeats and internal divisions, could not rally the necessary forces to defend the capital. Confederate forces, now at the gates of Washington, D.C., laid siege to the city. The Union military's failure to break the siege or mount a successful counterattack made it clear that the capital was no longer defensible. In a dramatic turn, the Union government evacuated from Washington, D.C., and Confederate forces took control of the city. The fall of Washington marked the symbolic and strategic end of the Union's ability to maintain its legitimacy. The Confederacy now had control of the capital of its former adversary, and its leaders, including President Jefferson Davis, were able to hold a victory celebration in the heart of what was once the Union's government. The battle for the capital represented a turning point in the war. With Washington, D.C. under Confederate control and the Union scrambling to respond, the Confederacy emerged as a legitimate force capable of challenging the Union's survival. The capture of the capital sent shockwaves throughout the world, and foreign powers quickly shifted their diplomatic stance, recognizing the South's sovereignty as the war reached its defining conclusion. Washington, D.C. in peril. As the Confederate Army's advances pushed deeper into Union territory, Washington, D.C., the heart of the federal government, found itself in unprecedented danger. In this alternate history, the Union's inability to halt the Confederate march after several key defeats allowed the South to approach the capital with a renewed sense of hope and determination. The proximity of the Confederate forces to Washington, D.C. marked a crisis point for the Union, both militarily and politically, as the Northern government grappled with the prospect of losing its symbolic and strategic stronghold. The Confederate strategy was clear. To strike directly at Washington, D.C., would not only deal a mortal blow to the Union's morale, but also effectively cripple the Northern government's ability to function. With the Union capital already under siege from several directions, the Confederate leadership, led by General Robert E. Lee, recognized that the fall of Washington would signal the collapse of the Union's ability to mount any further resistance. The Confederacy's military successes, including victories at Antietam, Fredericksburg, and Gettysburg, had left the Union forces scattered and demoralized, providing the perfect opportunity to strike. In Washington, President Abraham Lincoln and his cabinet faced a growing panic. There was a real fear that, should the Confederate forces breach the capital, the Union would be forced to not only abandon its government, but also lose the international legitimacy it had tried so hard to maintain. The war effort seemed doomed as Northern forces, already stretched thin and unable to prevent Confederate advances, were increasingly called to defend the capital itself. Many believed that if Washington fell, so too would the Union's hope of victory. As Confederate troops, bolstered by the support of European nations, pushed closer to Washington, the city became a scene of heightened security and political turmoil. The streets of the capital, once a symbol of unity, were now filled with soldiers and civilians alike, scrambling to prepare for the worst. Local militias and Union forces were stationed at key points around the city, attempting to create a defensive perimeter. However, the sheer scale of the threat posed by the Confederates left the capital vulnerable. With Washington in peril, Lincoln's government faced a difficult decision: to hold the city at all costs or to evacuate to preserve some semblance of authority. As Confederate forces surrounded the city, Lincoln, along with his advisors, chose the latter, leading to the withdrawal of key officials and a retreat to safety. The fall of Washington, D.C., to Confederate control marked a pivotal moment in the war, signaling not only a military defeat for the Union, but also the end of its claim to political supremacy. The Confederacy had not only defeated the Union on the battlefield, but had captured its very heart, reshaping the future of America. The Confederacy's move to Washington. The Confederacy's move to Washington was a bold and dramatic step in the Southern bid for independence. After years of bloody conflict and territorial gains, Confederate forces, led by General Robert E. Lee, finally pushed past the Union's defenses and set their sights on the ultimate prize, the Union capital itself. This decision was driven not only by military strategy, but by the realization that capturing Washington, D.C. would have far-reaching consequences, both psychologically and diplomatically, for the war's outcome. In the summer of 1864, the Confederacy, having gained significant momentum from victories at Gettysburg and other key engagements, began its concentrated push toward Washington. The Union's military, stretched thin by internal conflicts, resource shortages, and morale issues, could not effectively halt the Southern advance. Washington, once considered secure behind the Union's formidable defenses, now found itself vulnerable to a well-organized Confederate offensive. The Confederate forces understood that the capture of Washington would not only decimate Northern morale, but also solidify their position on the world stage as a legitimate, independent nation. The decision to move toward Washington was not taken lightly by Confederate leaders. General Lee, along with President Jefferson Davis, understood the high stakes. To take the capital meant not only defeating the Union militarily, but also achieving symbolic victory over the United States. It would be a psychological blow from which the North could never recover. The Confederacy had already gained recognition from European powers, and the capture of Washington would further cement its standing as a sovereign nation. As Confederate troops moved through Maryland and Virginia, the Union government scrambled to protect Washington, fortifying its defenses and calling upon every available resource to defend the city. However, despite their best efforts, the Union military could not mount an effective counteroffensive. With Confederate forces surrounding the capital and key Northern leaders questioning the viability of continuing the fight, the Union government was faced with an impossible choice. In a final, desperate move to preserve the core of their government, President Abraham Lincoln and his cabinet decided to evacuate Washington. Confederate troops, entering the city without significant resistance, took control of the federal government's seat. The symbolism of this moment was profound. The Confederacy had succeeded in not only pushing the Union to the brink, but also taking the heart of the United States. The Confederacy's move to Washington was a decisive moment in the war, marking the beginning of the South's dominance and the eventual collapse of the Union. As the South celebrated its triumph, the North reeled from the loss, unable to regain its capital or its footing in the conflict. Washington's fall sealed the Confederacy's place as an independent nation and changed the trajectory of American history forever. The Union's defensive strategy. As the Confederacy made significant advances in the Civil War's alternate timeline, the Union was forced to adopt a defensive strategy to preserve its remaining territory and defend its capital. The realization that direct confrontation with Confederate forces was becoming increasingly futile led Northern leaders to shift their approach, hoping to avoid further military defeats while seeking diplomatic solutions. The Union's defensive strategy, though aimed at stalling Confederate momentum, faced numerous challenges, including internal divisions, resource shortages, and the ever-growing pressure from foreign nations recognizing the Confederacy. The primary goal of the Union's defensive strategy was to protect key locations, particularly Washington, D.C., which had become the symbolic and operational center of the federal government. With Confederate forces encroaching on Northern territory, the Union prioritized fortifying its capital and other strategic points, such as Philadelphia and Baltimore. The military effort focused on strengthening the defensive perimeter around these cities and organizing a series of smaller but decisive battles that could slow the Confederate march toward the heart of the Union. The Union also sought to slow Confederate progress through a combination of guerrilla tactics and limited offensive operations. Northern militias, which had been underutilized earlier in the war, began to play a more prominent role in harassing Confederate supply lines and ambushing smaller Confederate units. These irregular forces, though not a substitute for a full-scale military confrontation, managed to create a constant drain on Southern resources and manpower. However, the Union's defensive strategy was complicated by its inability to field a unified and well-coordinated military command. Political infighting and frequent changes in leadership hindered the effectiveness of the Union's military efforts. Generals who failed to achieve significant victories were replaced, leading to a lack of continuity and strategic direction. While some Union commanders, like Ulysses S. Grant, continued to push for more aggressive operations, the overall strategy remained defensive, relying on holding key cities and waiting for Confederate fatigue to set in. One of the central difficulties in the Union's defensive strategy was the lack of public support for prolonged war. With Confederate victories mounting and Washington, D.C. in peril, Northern morale began to plummet. Anti-war sentiments grew louder, especially among working-class citizens who were increasingly affected by the war's economic strain. These domestic pressures led some Northern leaders to advocate for peace talks with the Confederacy, signaling a weakening of resolve within the Union. Despite its efforts, the Union's defensive strategy ultimately proved insufficient in preventing the Confederacy from seizing Washington and solidifying its independence. The inability to mount a successful counteroffensive or regain control of key cities like the capital sealed the Union's fate. The strategy, though aimed at prolonging the war, did little to change the course of history, as the Confederacy's victory became inevitable. Chapter 4: A Divided Nation. With the fall of Washington, D.C., and the Confederacy's recognition as an independent nation, the United States found itself permanently fractured. What had once been a unified country, bound together by shared history and a common government, was now two distinct nations with opposing ideologies, economies, and political structures. This division was not merely geographical. It was a deep and lasting rift that reshaped the future of North America and the world. The North, now forced to reckon with its defeat, struggled to rebuild its identity and determine its next course of action. The loss of the war did not just mean the recognition of the Confederate States of America. It also signified a loss of moral and political authority. Many in the North viewed the outcome as a betrayal of the principles of liberty and democracy. The abolitionist movement, once a powerful force, was left without a clear purpose, as slavery remained deeply entrenched in the South. The political landscape in the remaining Union states became one of uncertainty, with leaders debating whether to pursue a path of reconciliation with the Confederacy or to maintain a cold and tense separation. In the South, victory brought a sense of triumph, but also significant challenges. The Confederate government, now firmly in place, had to transition from wartime governance to managing an independent nation. Economic struggles persisted as the South worked to strengthen its trade relationships with Europe and other nations that had recognized its sovereignty. While the Confederacy celebrated its independence, internal divisions still existed. Debates arose over the future of expansion, foreign alliances, and the long-term sustainability of an economy built on slavery. The division between North and South also had profound social consequences. Families that had been split by the war now faced the reality of living in separate nations, with restricted movement between the two. Trade, once a major link between the regions, became heavily regulated, with tariffs and border disputes emerging. Former Union states along the border, such as Kentucky and Missouri, found themselves caught between two nations, leading to ongoing instability and conflict. On the global stage, the division of the United States reshaped international politics. European nations, having supported or recognized the Confederacy, now adjusted their alliances and economic strategies accordingly. Britain and France, in particular, strengthened their ties with the South, benefiting from the continued supply of cotton. Meanwhile, the Union, weakened by its loss, had to rebuild its standing among world powers, navigating diplomatic challenges in a world that no longer saw it as an unchallenged force. The once united nation was now permanently divided, each side forging its own path. The war had ended, but the scars of separation would shape the destinies of both the Union and the Confederacy for generations to come. The Northern response to loss. The Union's defeat in the Civil War and the Confederacy's successful secession sent shockwaves through the North. The idea of a divided America, once unthinkable, had now become a reality. As the Confederate States of America solidified its independence, the remaining Union states were left to grapple with the consequences of their failure. The loss of Washington, D.C., and the collapse of the Union war effort created political chaos, economic instability, and deep divisions among Northern citizens. In the immediate aftermath, there was a period of disbelief and mourning. Many Northerners had viewed the war as a moral struggle to preserve the Union and abolish slavery, and its outcome was devastating. President Abraham Lincoln, having evacuated the capital before its fall, attempted to rally the Northern states to maintain unity, but political infighting made Reconstruction efforts difficult. Some leaders called for renewed resistance, believing that the Union could still reclaim lost territory, while others advocated for accepting the new reality and focusing on rebuilding. The economic impact of the loss was severe. The Union had spent vast resources on the war, and with its defeat, the country faced financial collapse. Trade routes that once connected the industrial North with the agrarian South were now severed, disrupting commerce. Manufacturing cities such as New York, Boston, and Chicago, which had depended on Southern cotton and agricultural products, struggled to adjust to the new trade restrictions imposed by the Confederate government. Unemployment and inflation soared, and public frustration grew. Socially, the Northern response was marked by widespread unrest. The abolitionist movement, which had been a powerful force in the war, found itself directionless. With slavery still intact in the South and no power to challenge it, many abolitionists shifted their focus to internal reforms, while others considered new efforts to aid enslaved people escaping the Confederacy. Meanwhile, resentment toward the South grew, and anti-Confederate sentiment fueled nationalist movements within the remaining Union states. The idea of reclaiming lost territories through future conflicts began to take shape among more radical elements of Northern society. Diplomatically, the North was now in a weaker position on the world stage. European nations, having recognized the Confederacy, saw the Union as a diminished power. The former United States, once a growing force in global affairs, now faced diplomatic isolation. Seeking to rebuild alliances, the Union focused on strengthening its ties with nations that had remained neutral, attempting to regain international credibility. Despite the devastation, the North slowly began to recover, determined to redefine itself in the new political landscape. While the scars of loss remained, the Union states pushed forward, seeking a future where they could once again emerge as a strong and unified power, even if the United States as it once existed was gone forever. The economic impacts on the Union. The Union's defeat and the Confederacy's successful secession triggered a financial and industrial crisis that reshaped the Northern economy. Once the industrial powerhouse of a united nation, the North now faced economic instability due to the loss of key trade relationships, rising debt, and a labor force struggling to adapt to the post-war reality. With the South no longer under its control, the Union was forced to restructure its industries, seek new markets, and adjust to the geopolitical consequences of its failure. One of the most immediate impacts was the disruption of trade. Before the war, the Northern economy depended on Southern raw materials, especially cotton, which fueled the booming textile mills in cities like Boston, Philadelphia, and New York. With the Confederacy now an independent nation, those trade routes were cut off, forcing Northern manufacturers to seek alternative suppliers. This led to a sharp decline in production, widespread factory closures, and mass unemployment. The economic depression that followed created unrest among the working class, who had already endured hardships during the war. Additionally, the Union was burdened with a massive war debt. Having spent billions on military campaigns, infrastructure, and supplies, the Northern government now faced the challenge of repaying loans with a weakened economy. Inflation soared as the federal government struggled to stabilize its currency, and bondholders demanded repayment. The financial sector in major cities like New York and Chicago experienced instability, leading to bank failures and the collapse of many businesses that had relied on government contracts during the war. The agricultural sector in the North also suffered. While not as reliant on cash crops as the South, Northern farmers had depended on trade with Southern states to sell their goods. The loss of these markets meant an oversupply of grains and other agricultural products, leading to plummeting prices. Many farmers, unable to sustain their businesses, lost their land, deepening the economic crisis. In response, the Union sought new international markets, but European nations, already engaged in strong trade with the Confederacy, were reluctant to shift their alliances. Despite these hardships, the Union began to adapt by investing in internal development. The loss of Southern cotton forced industrialists to explore alternative materials, and new economic policies encouraged domestic innovation. Railroads continued to expand westward, connecting the remaining Union states and opening opportunities for new settlements and industries. The government also implemented protective tariffs to shield Northern businesses from foreign competition, further pushing economic self-sufficiency. The economic consequences of losing the war were devastating, but they also forced the Union to evolve. No longer dependent on the South, the North sought to redefine its economy in ways that would make it more resilient. While recovery was slow, the Union's ability to adapt laid the foundation for a new industrial era. one built on necessity rather than dependence on a fractured past. Diplomacy and war on the international stage. The Confederacy's victory and subsequent independence reshaped global politics, shifting alliances and altering the balance of power. The divided American continent created new diplomatic challenges, as both the Union and the Confederacy sought to assert their influence in an international arena dominated by European powers. While the Confederacy worked to solidify its place among the world's nations, the Union faced an uphill battle to recover from its defeat and prevent further territorial losses. The Confederacy, having secured recognition from Britain and France during the war, quickly moved to strengthen these ties. Cotton exports became the backbone of its foreign policy, ensuring economic dependence from European markets. With the Union no longer able to blockade southern ports, the Confederacy expanded trade agreements, allowing for the import of advanced weaponry and industrial goods that it had previously lacked. Britain, which had long sought to maintain a balance of power in North America, saw an opportunity to influence Confederate policies and secure favorable trade deals. France, under Napoleon III, also sought a stronger foothold in the Western Hemisphere, particularly through its intervention in Mexico. Meanwhile, the Union faced diplomatic isolation. Once seen as an emerging global power, it now struggled to maintain alliances. European nations viewed the Union's defeat as a sign of weakness, and its ability to project power was significantly reduced. The loss of Southern trade made economic recovery difficult, forcing the Union to seek new partners. Some Northern leaders proposed closer ties with Germany and Russia, nations that had remained neutral during the war and had their own reasons for opposing British and French influence in the Americas. Tensions between the Union and the Confederacy did not end with the war. Border conflicts flared up, particularly in disputed territories along the Mississippi River and the western frontier. The possibility of renewed war remained ever present, as both nations built up their militaries in anticipation of future conflicts. The Confederacy, fearing Union retaliation, sought European military advisors and modernized its defenses. The Union, still bitter over its defeat, developed strategies for potential reconquest, though economic and political instability made such plans difficult to execute. The broader world also took notice of the American divide. Spain, still clinging to its remaining colonies in the Caribbean, saw the new geopolitical landscape as an opportunity to reassert its influence. Latin American nations, many of which had opposed slavery, reacted with caution to the Confederacy's rise, fearing Southern expansionist ambitions. Mexico, already struggling against French intervention, remained a key battleground where Union and Confederate interests clashed indirectly. The world had changed, and the once united United States was no longer the dominant force in North America. Instead, a fragile balance emerged, with both the Union and the Confederacy vying for power, influence, and security in an uncertain international order. Chapter 5: The Southern Economy Rebuilt. With its independence secured, the Confederacy faced the immense challenge of rebuilding its economy. The war had devastated Southern infrastructure, agriculture, and trade, leaving the newly formed nation struggling to stabilize itself. While the South's economy remained heavily reliant on agriculture, particularly cotton, its leaders recognized the need to modernize and expand economic opportunities to ensure long-term survival. The cornerstone of the Confederate economy remained cotton exports, which had driven its diplomatic success during the war. With the Union blockade lifted, the South resumed its lucrative trade with Britain, France, and other European nations eager for raw materials. Southern leaders sought to strengthen these relationships by formalizing long-term trade agreements, ensuring a steady flow of revenue. However, reliance on cotton also exposed the Confederacy to economic vulnerabilities, as any disruption in demand or supply could create financial instability. To further rebuild, the Confederate government invested in infrastructure projects. Railroads, many of which had been destroyed during the war, were repaired and expanded to improve transportation of goods. Ports along the Gulf of Mexico and the Atlantic were modernized to facilitate international trade. While the South had historically lagged behind the North in industrial development, Confederate leaders began encouraging limited industrialization, particularly in the production of textiles, weapons, and processed agricultural goods. This shift was slow, as the planter class resisted changes that might threaten the dominance of the agrarian economy. The issue of labor remained a contentious one. Slavery had been a key institution in the South, and with independence it remained firmly in place. However, some Confederate leaders debated ways to adapt the system to prevent internal and external pressures for reform. Some proposed gradual changes, such as allowing skilled enslaved workers to earn wages or introducing limited forms of tenant farming. Still, the vast majority of the Southern economy continued to depend on enslaved labor, leading to growing tensions with nations that opposed slavery. The Confederacy also faced financial difficulties. The war had drained resources, and foreign creditors demanded repayment for loans taken during the conflict. To stabilize its currency, the Confederate government established a national banking system and sought to implement a more structured taxation policy. These efforts met resistance from state governments, as the Confederacy had been founded on the principle of states' rights, making centralized economic control difficult. Despite these challenges, the Southern economy gradually recovered. International demand for cotton remained high, and new trade routes allowed for steady economic growth. While industrialization remained secondary to agriculture, slow progress was made in diversifying the economy. The Confederacy had survived the war, but the path to long-term prosperity depended on its ability to adapt to a rapidly changing world while preserving the economic foundations that had defined it. The role of slavery in the new Confederacy. With its independence secured, the Confederacy remained committed to the institution of slavery, which had been central to its economic and social structure. Southern leaders saw slavery as the foundation of their prosperity and resisted any efforts to limit or abolish it. However, as the new nation sought to establish itself on the global stage, the long-term sustainability of slavery became a growing concern. In the immediate aftermath of the war, the Confederate government reinforced laws protecting slavery, ensuring that the institution remained intact. Plantation owners, having suffered losses during the conflict, quickly sought to rebuild their labor force, often implementing harsher restrictions to prevent rebellion or escape. The expansion of slavery into newly acquired Western territories became a major priority as the Confederacy aimed to extend its economic model across the continent. Enslaved people continued to work under brutal conditions, their labor fueling the cotton-driven economy that kept the South afloat. Despite its firm stance, the Confederacy faced external pressures regarding slavery. European nations, particularly Britain and France, had long since abolished the practice and had only supported the Confederacy for economic reasons. Now that the war was over, these nations grew increasingly uncomfortable maintaining strong ties with a slaveholding nation. While they continued to import Southern cotton, diplomatic tensions arose, with some European leaders pushing for gradual emancipation as a condition for deeper economic and political alliances. Domestically, debates emerged over how slavery should evolve within the Confederacy. Some Southern leaders, recognizing that permanent reliance on enslaved labor could isolate the nation from key allies, proposed limited reforms, such as allowing enslaved people to earn wages or granting freedom to those who served in the military. Others adamantly opposed any changes, fearing that even minor concessions would undermine the entire system. These divisions led to internal conflicts within the Confederate government, as some states sought greater control over their own policies rather than adhering to federal mandates. Resistance among the enslaved population also persisted. Despite harsh laws, thousands continued to escape, seeking refuge in northern states or Mexico. Secret abolitionist networks operated within the Confederacy, and periodic uprisings forced local militias to maintain constant vigilance. The Confederate government responded with stricter enforcement of slave codes, deploying additional resources to suppress resistance and maintain order. As the Confederacy moved forward, slavery remained both its greatest strength and its greatest weakness. While it sustained the economy and upheld the Southern way of life, it also left the new nation vulnerable to international condemnation, internal unrest, and the ever-present fear of conflict. The question of slavery's future loomed over the Confederacy, shaping its policies, its relationships, and its uncertain place in the world. Economic and agricultural development. After securing its independence, the Confederacy faced the immense challenge of building a stable and self-sufficient economy. While agriculture remained the backbone of Southern wealth, Confederate leaders recognized the need for modernization and diversification to ensure long-term prosperity. The war had devastated infrastructure, disrupted trade, and left the South heavily reliant on foreign support. Rebuilding required strategic planning, investment, and adaptation to an evolving global market. Cotton remained the cornerstone of the Confederate economy, as European demand for the crop ensured steady revenue. Without Northern interference, the South expanded its trade networks with Britain, France, and other textile-producing nations. To maximize production, plantation owners sought to rebuild their labor force, reinforcing the institution of slavery despite growing international pressure to abolish it. However, dependence on a single cash crop left the economy vulnerable to fluctuations in global prices and shifts in international demand. Recognizing this weakness, some Confederate leaders encouraged agricultural diversification. Efforts were made to increase the production of tobacco, rice, and sugarcane, while certain regions invested in livestock and grain farming to reduce reliance on northern imports. The development of internal markets became a priority, as the Confederacy aimed to sustain itself without dependence on external goods. Southern railroads, many of which had been destroyed during the war, were rebuilt and expanded to improve transportation and facilitate commerce between states. Industrialization, however, remained slow. The South had long lagged behind the North in manufacturing, relying on imported goods for tools, weapons, and machinery. With independence, the Confederacy sought to develop its own industries, particularly in the production of textiles and arms. Ironworks and mills were established in key cities like Richmond and Atlanta, but progress was limited by a lack of skilled labor and capital investment. The agrarian elite, who held political and economic power, resisted large-scale industrialization, fearing it would challenge the traditional plantation system. Financing economic growth proved difficult. The war had left the Confederacy in debt, and securing foreign loans became a top priority. Britain and France, eager to maintain trade relations, provided limited financial assistance, though they remained cautious about long-term commitments. The Confederate government introduced new taxation policies to fund infrastructure projects, but resistance from states made consistent revenue collection a challenge. Inflation remained a persistent issue, as Confederate currencies struggled to gain stability in international markets. Despite these challenges, the Confederate economy gradually recovered. Agricultural expansion, improved transportation, and strategic trade agreements helped stabilize the nation. However, long-term success depended on balancing traditional agrarian values with the demands of modernization. As the Confederacy moved forward, the challenge remained: could it evolve beyond its plantation economy, or would its dependence on slavery and cash crops ultimately limit its future growth? Trade with Europe and the global market. With its independence secured, the Confederacy turned its focus to establishing strong economic ties with Europe and integrating itself into the global market. The South's economy remained heavily reliant on agricultural exports, particularly cotton, and Confederate leaders saw international trade as the key to their nation's long-term stability. Britain and France, both of whom had supported the Confederacy diplomatically and economically during the war, became its primary trading partners. Cotton was the Confederacy's most valuable commodity, often referred to as King Cotton due to its dominance in the global textile industry. With the Union blockade lifted, southern ports like Charleston, New Orleans, and Mobile became bustling trade hubs, shipping vast amounts of raw cotton to European factories. British and French textile manufacturers, eager to secure a steady supply, formalized trade agreements with the Confederate government, ensuring that southern plantations had a reliable market for their goods. In return, the Confederacy imported manufactured products, weapons, and industrial machinery that had previously come from the North. However, reliance on a single cash crop posed economic risks. Global cotton prices fluctuated based on supply and demand, and any economic downturn in Europe could significantly impact the Confederacy's financial stability. To counter this, Confederate leaders encouraged agricultural diversification, increasing the production of tobacco, rice, sugarcane, and livestock. Though these industries expanded, they never reached the same level of profitability as cotton. The Confederacy also sought to develop its own merchant fleet to reduce dependence on foreign shipping. While British and French vessels transported most Southern goods, Confederate leaders pushed for investment in domestic shipbuilding to establish a stronger presence in global trade. Some Southern entrepreneurs established shipping companies, but the industry remained underdeveloped compared to European counterparts. International politics also played a role in trade relations. While Britain and France engaged in commerce with the Confederacy, they remained wary of fully aligning with a slaveholding nation. As abolitionist movements gained strength in Europe, pressure mounted on Confederate leaders to reconsider their stance on slavery. Some European politicians called for gradual emancipation in exchange for deeper economic and military alliances, creating tension between Southern political factions. The Confederacy also faced competition from other cotton-producing regions. Egypt and India, both under British influence, expanded their cotton industries, providing alternative sources for European manufacturers. If the Confederacy failed to maintain competitive pricing and consistent production, it risked losing its dominant position in the global cotton trade. Despite these challenges, the Confederacy's economy remained deeply tied to European markets. Its ability to thrive depended on maintaining strong diplomatic relationships, adapting to market shifts, and finding ways to modernize its economic structure without undermining its traditional agrarian foundation. Chapter 6: The Rise of the Confederacy's Military. With independence secured, the Confederacy faced the urgent task of building a formidable military capable of defending its sovereignty and deterring future threats. While the war had proven the tactical brilliance of Southern generals and the resilience of its soldiers, the newly formed nation needed to transition from a wartime force to a professional, standing army. This required extensive restructuring, modernization, and strategic planning to ensure long-term security. One of the Confederacy's first priorities was establishing a permanent military structure. During the war, the Confederate Army had largely relied on state militias and volunteer regiments. Now, the government sought to create a centralized military force under a unified command. Robert E. Lee, widely regarded as the South's most capable military leader, played a crucial role in shaping this new army. Military academies, such as the Confederate Military Institute in Richmond, expanded to train future officers, ensuring a steady supply of skilled leadership. Weapons production was another key concern. Throughout the war, the South had relied on foreign imports and captured Union supplies to arm its soldiers. With independence, the Confederacy invested heavily in developing its own arms industry. Foundries in Richmond, Atlanta, and Selma expanded their capacity, producing rifles, artillery, and ammunition on a larger scale. However, industrial limitations meant that the South still depended on European suppliers for advanced weaponry and naval technology. The Confederate Navy also underwent significant expansion. During the war, Southern naval forces had been limited, relying on blockade runners and a small fleet of ironclads. Now, with access to foreign ports and shipyards, the Confederacy sought to build a modern navy capable of protecting its coastline and trade routes. Deals were struck with British and French shipbuilders to acquire warships, while domestic shipyards in New Orleans and Charleston worked to increase production. Conscription remained a contentious issue. While many Southerners took pride in military service, the devastation of war had left manpower shortages. The Confederate government implemented policies to maintain a strong defense force while balancing economic needs. Some leaders proposed limited enlistment of enslaved men in exchange for freedom, a controversial idea that sparked fierce debate among the planter class. Ultimately, maintaining a professional, well-equipped army without overburdening the civilian population became an ongoing challenge. Diplomatically, the Confederacy sought alliances to strengthen its military position. While Britain and France had supported the South economically, they remained hesitant to engage in direct military alliances. Southern diplomats worked to secure defense agreements, offering trade incentives and strategic partnerships in exchange for military aid. The rise of the Confederacy's military symbolized its commitment to survival and dominance in the Western Hemisphere. While it had achieved independence through war, maintaining it required continuous adaptation, strategic alliances, and the ability to project power both at home and abroad. General Lee's leadership and legacy. General Robert E. Lee was the Confederacy's most revered military leader, a strategist whose battlefield brilliance played a pivotal role in securing Southern independence. His leadership not only shaped the course of the war, but also influenced the development of the newly formed Confederate States. As a commander, statesman, and national symbol, Lee's legacy extended far beyond the battlefield, leaving an enduring mark on the South's military and political landscape. During the war, Lee's tactical expertise was unmatched. His ability to outmaneuver Union forces, despite often being outnumbered and outgunned, secured key victories at battles such as Chancellorsville and Fredericksburg. His bold decision-making, exemplified in his daring invasions of the North, cemented his reputation as a fearless and resourceful leader. Even in the face of defeat at Gettysburg, his composure and determination inspired loyalty among his troops. His leadership ultimately guided the Confederacy to military success, forcing the Union to recognize Southern independence. With the war concluded, Lee turned his focus toward stabilizing the Confederacy. He advocated for a strong, professional military to protect the new nation's borders and maintain order. Many viewed him as the natural choice for the Confederacy's first Secretary of War, a position that allowed him to oversee military reforms and the expansion of Southern defenses. His influence shaped the development of Confederate military academies, training the next generation of officers who would uphold the South's security. Beyond the military, Lee became a unifying figure for the Confederacy. While some leaders pushed for aggressive expansion or lingering hostilities with the Union, Lee urged reconciliation and national unity. His voice carried immense weight, helping to establish a sense of Southern identity rooted in resilience, tradition, and honor. Though he remained committed to the ideals of the Confederacy, he recognized the need for diplomatic stability and economic recovery. However, Lee's legacy was not without controversy. His unwavering defense of the Southern cause, particularly its reliance on slavery, led to debates about his role in shaping the new nation's moral and political future. As the Confederacy faced increasing international pressure to reform its social structure, Lee remained a staunch defender of the status quo, believing that gradual change, if necessary, should come from within rather than outside influence. As years passed, Lee became a larger-than-life figure in Confederate history. Statues and memorials were erected in his honor, and his strategies were studied by military scholars worldwide. His leadership during the war and his influence in peacetime made him one of the most significant figures in Confederate history. His name became synonymous with Southern pride, military excellence, and the enduring spirit of the Confederacy. Confederate military innovation. In the aftermath of the Civil War, the Confederacy faced the challenge of adapting its military to new realities while remaining competitive in a rapidly changing world. Despite being an agrarian society with limited industrial resources, the South was forced to innovate out of necessity. Confederate military leaders, recognizing that they could not compete with the industrialized North in terms of manpower and resources, turned to technological and strategic innovation to strengthen their position on the battlefield. One of the most notable examples of Confederate military innovation was the development of ironclad warships. With the North's Navy employing traditional wooden vessels, the South sought to build a new kind of warship that could withstand cannon fire and engage more effectively in naval combat. The most famous of these was the CSS Virginia, which played a pivotal role in the Battle of Hampton Roads. Though the Virginia was ultimately defeated by the Union's USS Monitor, it demonstrated the potential of ironclads to revolutionize naval warfare, and both sides began to pursue this technology with greater urgency. On land, Confederate military engineers were at the forefront of developing new weapons and tactics. The introduction of the repeating rifle, particularly the Spencer rifle, allowed Southern soldiers to fire multiple rounds without reloading, providing a significant advantage in certain combat scenarios. Although the South was initially slow to adopt such technologies, by the war's end, Confederate forces had made strides in integrating advanced firearms into their arsenal. Another area of innovation was the use of railroads. Although the South's rail network was less extensive than the North's, Confederate leaders recognized the importance of using railroads for the rapid movement of troops and supplies. Innovations in logistics allowed for more efficient transportation, enabling the Confederacy to move resources across vast distances. Some Southern generals, like Thomas Stonewall Jackson, made effective use of railroads to conduct swift surprise attacks, further complicating Union strategies. Confederate commanders also turned to new tactics to maximize their effectiveness. Guerrilla warfare and the use of irregular forces became essential components of Confederate strategy. Leaders like Nathan Bedford Forrest capitalized on these tactics, using small, mobile units to harass Union supply lines and engage in hit-and-run attacks. These methods disrupted Union forces and played a key role in Confederate successes, especially in the early years of the war. Despite these innovations, the Confederacy struggled with resource limitations and the lack of a cohesive industrial base. As the war dragged on, many of these advancements were not enough to offset the sheer industrial might of the Union. Nevertheless, the ingenuity displayed by Confederate military leaders remains a testament to their resourcefulness and determination in the face of overwhelming odds. The role of slavery in military strategy. Slavery was an integral part of the Confederate economy and society, and its influence extended into military strategy throughout the Civil War. The Confederacy's reliance on slavery shaped the way it organized its forces, deployed resources, and even conducted military operations. While much of the South's military strategy was focused on defense and maintaining its independence from the Union, the institution of slavery played a pivotal role in shaping both tactical decisions and larger strategic goals. From the outset of the war, Southern military leaders understood that maintaining slavery was crucial to the Confederacy's survival. The labor of enslaved people supported the South's agricultural economy, particularly the production of cotton, tobacco, and other cash crops, which were vital to the war effort. This economic foundation influenced military strategy as securing and preserving these resources became a top priority for Confederate forces. The protection of plantations, especially those in key regions like the Deep South, became a central element of defensive operations. Slavery also influenced the Confederate Army's approach to manpower. While the South had a smaller free population than the North, its slave population far exceeded that of the Union's. Initially, Confederate leaders resisted the idea of arming enslaved people, fearing that it would undermine the institution of slavery itself. However, as the war progressed and manpower shortages grew, the Confederacy reluctantly turned to the idea of using enslaved individuals in support roles, such as laborers, cooks, and teamsters. By 1865, the Confederate Congress passed a law allowing enslaved men to be enlisted in the Army in exchange for their freedom, though this policy was never fully implemented due to the dwindling resources and military manpower. In addition to labor, slavery played a key role in the Confederate military's broader strategy of using the institution to gain diplomatic recognition. The South relied heavily on cotton exports to Europe, hoping that nations like Britain and France would intervene on their behalf in exchange for access to Southern cotton. Confederate leaders viewed the protection of slavery as essential to maintaining economic ties with European powers, and sought to convince them that Southern independence and the preservation of slavery was in their best interest. This belief shaped Confederate diplomatic strategies, leading to efforts to secure foreign intervention or recognition in the early years of the war. Moreover, Confederate generals often considered the impact of slavery when making tactical decisions. For example, preserving large agricultural areas and plantations meant ensuring the continued supply of food, clothing, and other resources for the Southern Army. Additionally, securing slave labor was seen as essential for constructing fortifications, maintaining supply lines, and supporting military campaigns. As the Union blockade tightened, the Southern reliance on slavery for labor intensified, and any threat to the institution of slavery was viewed not only as a blow to the Confederate way of life, but also as a significant military disadvantage. The role of slavery in Confederate military strategy highlighted the deep connections between the South's economic system and its military operations. While the strategic value of slavery was undeniable, the Confederacy's reliance on it also posed significant challenges, particularly as Union forces focused on weakening the institution through emancipation policies and military action. Chapter 7: Reconstruction under a Confederate Victory. Following a Confederate victory in the Civil War, the process of Reconstruction would take on a radically different form than what occurred under the Union's post-war efforts. With the Confederacy having successfully secured its independence, the South faced the monumental task of rebuilding not only its war-torn infrastructure, but also its societal institutions, deeply impacted by both the war and the end of slavery. The Confederate victory provided a unique opportunity for Southern leaders to shape a new political and economic order that was grounded in their cultural values and vision for the future. In the early years of Confederate Reconstruction, the Southern government would prioritize restoring the agricultural economy, which had been decimated by the war. With plantations in ruin and fields left abandoned or ravaged by battles, the Confederacy sought to reestablish its primary source of wealth, cotton and other cash crops. However, the end of slavery created new challenges. The South's reliance on enslaved labor had been central to its agricultural system, and now, with the abolition of slavery, landowners faced the need for new labor arrangements. Some plantations turned to sharecropping, while others experimented with labor contracts, attempting to rebuild a system that would preserve the economic structure of the pre-war South. Politically, the South would need to consolidate its position as an independent nation. With European recognition of the Confederacy, it would have the support to avoid diplomatic isolation, which had hampered the Union's efforts during the Civil War. The Southern government would work to formalize its place in the global community, striving to ensure economic stability through international trade, especially with European powers that relied on Southern cotton. In the absence of Northern influence, Confederate leaders would likely push for a political system that reflected their agrarian ideals. further entrenching the class divisions between the planter elite and the freed African Americans who now sought to redefine their role in Southern society. The Confederacy's victory would also bring a shift in the social and racial order. Freed African Americans, now no longer bound by slavery, would strive for civil rights and equality, pushing for full participation in Southern society. However, the transition would be met with intense resistance from the former slaveholding class, many of whom would continue to hold significant power in the new Confederate government. While the Confederate leadership might have formally granted citizenship and legal rights to freed people, in practice, many would face legal, economic, and social restrictions that maintained a racial hierarchy. As a new Confederate nation worked to rebuild its economy and institutions, the specter of racial and social tensions would loom large. Without the unifying force of the Union, the South would be left to navigate the complexities of its divided social fabric and carve out a place in a world now different from the one it had known before the war. Reconstruction under a Confederate victory would, therefore, not only be about physical rebuilding, but also the reshaping of Southern identity, politics, and race relations in a nation that had achieved independence, but whose future remained uncertain. The South's Reconstruction Plan. Following a Confederate victory, the South's Reconstruction would be shaped by a desire to restore its economic and social order, but this time under the umbrella of independence. The Southern leadership would focus on rebuilding the agrarian economy that had been disrupted by the war and adjusting to the loss of slavery, which had been the backbone of their economic system. The Reconstruction Plan would be driven by the need to maintain the plantation-based economy while navigating the profound changes brought by the end of slavery. One of the primary goals of the South's Reconstruction Plan would be to stabilize the economy, which had been devastated by years of war. Agriculture would remain the central economic engine, but the transition from slave labor to a free labor system posed a significant challenge. In the absence of enslaved workers, the South would likely continue to rely on sharecropping or tenant farming, which would allow landowners to maintain control over agricultural production while providing newly freed African Americans with a means of subsistence. However, this system often led to cycles of debt and poverty for the laborers, maintaining an economic dependency that echoed the old slavery system in many ways. The South would also focus on rebuilding its infrastructure, particularly railroads and ports, which had been heavily damaged during the war. Restoring these vital transportation routes was essential for facilitating trade, especially with European nations that were vital to the South's cotton economy. Southern leaders would seek to reestablish strong trade ties with Europe, hoping that the need for Southern cotton would encourage European powers, particularly Britain and France, to support the new Confederacy politically and economically. Politically, the South would seek to entrench its newly won independence by solidifying the Confederate Constitution and governance. The Confederate leadership, largely made up of former plantation elites, would aim to maintain a political structure that reflected their interests, with a focus on limited government and states' rights. While some progressive changes would be made, such as granting civil rights to freed African Americans, the entrenched power of the Southern elite would likely limit the scope of true political equality. Socially, the South's Reconstruction Plan would attempt to manage the shift from a slave-based society to one in which African Americans were legally free. However, it is unlikely that the South would grant full equality. Racial tensions would remain high, and discriminatory laws, such as black codes or similar legal measures, would likely be introduced to maintain social control and limit the freedoms of newly freed people. Southern society would attempt to maintain the racial hierarchy that had existed before the war, though this would be increasingly difficult as African Americans fought for their rights and a new social order emerged. Ultimately, the South's Reconstruction Plan would seek to rebuild the region's economy, establish political independence, and deal with the social upheaval of a post-slavery society. However, the legacy of slavery and the racial dynamics of the period would continue to shape the challenges of this reconstruction, with the South's future marked by ongoing tensions between the forces of tradition and change. Political and social changes in the South. In the aftermath of a Confederate victory, the political and social landscape of the South would undergo significant changes as the region navigated its new identity as an independent nation. While the South sought to maintain many of its traditional social structures, it would also be forced to adapt to the challenges brought about by the end of slavery and the broader shifts in the global and national political climate. Politically, the South would aim to solidify its newfound independence by entrenching the Confederate system of government. The Confederate Constitution, which had been a point of pride for the South during the war, would likely remain in place, with a continued emphasis on states' rights and a decentralized federal system. The Confederacy would seek to build stable diplomatic relations with European powers, particularly Britain and France, in hopes of gaining recognition as a legitimate sovereign nation. This recognition would be crucial for the South's economic recovery, especially trade agreements focused on cotton exports. The South's political leadership, largely composed of former plantation elites, would likely maintain control, limiting the scope for broader political reforms. Any democratic advancements would be tempered by the desire to preserve the old social order, with power largely remaining in the hands of the wealthy landowners. Socially, the end of slavery marked the most significant transformation in the South. Although African Americans were legally free, their newfound freedom would be restricted by both formal and informal barriers. The Southern elite, who had once relied on enslaved labor to sustain their wealth and power, would resist granting full civil rights to African Americans. Instead, they would attempt to maintain a racial hierarchy through laws and social practices that limited the economic, social, and political freedoms of freed people. Sharecropping and tenant farming would become widespread, creating economic dependency that mirrored the conditions of slavery. In the cities, a new class of professionals and laborers would begin to emerge, but the majority of African Americans in the South would continue to work in agriculture. While some would manage to acquire land or move to urban centers, the bulk of the population would remain in rural areas, facing poverty and limited opportunities. Education for African Americans would also remain highly restricted, as many Southern states would implement laws that limited access to schools and institutions for Black people. The social fabric of the South would be further strained by the tension between the old guard, who sought to preserve their pre-war way of life, and the growing calls for equality from African Americans. As the South entered a new phase of its history, the political and social changes would largely reflect a struggle for control over the region's future, as the legacies of slavery and the fight for independence cast long shadows over Southern society. Race relations and the future of slavery. In the aftermath of a Confederate victory, race relations would remain one of the most contentious and defining issues of Southern society. The Confederacy's victory, which ensured the continuation of white supremacy and the protection of slavery, set the stage for a complex and turbulent future for both African Americans and white Southerners. Although slavery was no longer the institution it once was, its legacy would continue to shape the racial dynamics of the South and influence its trajectory. Slavery, although formally abolished during the war, would likely persist in some form within the Confederate states due to the region's deep dependence on an agricultural economy. While the practice of chattel slavery may have been abolished, the broader concept of racial control would remain embedded in the social and economic fabric of the South. Laws designed to maintain a rigid social hierarchy would continue to impact race relations, and racial segregation would be institutionalized through a series of legal measures. Many Southern leaders would likely argue that maintaining some form of forced labor, or at least limiting the economic autonomy of African Americans, was necessary for the region's survival. In this context, a modified system of servitude or sharecropping could become more widespread, further entrenching economic inequality and racial subjugation. The aim would be to ensure that the freed African American population remained economically dependent on white landowners, effectively recreating a system that resembled slavery without its legal status. As the newly freed African Americans sought to claim their rights and establish their independence, they would encounter fierce resistance from the white Southern elite. Efforts to secure land, education, and political participation would be met with violence and legal restrictions, such as black codes, which were designed to limit the freedoms of African Americans. Though African Americans would demand equal rights, the Southern power structure would seek to maintain control through economic and social means, ensuring that the power dynamics that had existed under slavery remained largely intact. In this scenario, race relations in the Confederacy would be marked by a struggle between the forces of white supremacy, which sought to preserve the status quo, and the African American population, which sought to redefine their place in society. As freed African Americans fought for civil rights, the Confederacy would find itself entrenched in a battle between its political and social traditions and the growing calls for racial equality and justice. The future of slavery, in this context, would not be about its formal existence, but rather about the ways in which the South would attempt to maintain a racialized economy and society. The legacy of slavery would continue to reverberate through the Southern states for generations to come, shaping the future of race relations in the Confederacy and beyond. Chapter 8, Northern Identity in Crisis. The outcome of the Civil War, with the South securing its independence, would have a profound and destabilizing impact on the North's sense of self and national identity. Having fought a brutal and costly war to preserve the Union, the North would face the difficult reality of a fractured country, one that no longer shared the same goals, values, or vision for the future. The Confederacy's victory would challenge the North's beliefs in the supremacy of the Union and the idea that the United States was destined to be a singular nation. The North's initial reaction would be one of disbelief and profound disillusionment. The collapse of the Union would not only represent a failure on the battlefield, but also a failure of the ideals that had driven the Northern cause. The loss of the Civil War would cause many in the North to question their political and moral direction, leading to a period of national soul-searching. What had the Union been fighting for, and why had it failed to preserve its unity? The abolition of slavery, one of the war's central aims, would now be overshadowed by the South's success in breaking away. The North would wrestle with the implications of this defeat, questioning its own identity and role in the world. The economic impact on the North would also play a major role in this crisis of identity. The war had devastated much of the Southern economy, but the Northern economy, too, had suffered significant losses. Northern industries that had been thriving during the war, especially those linked to arms manufacturing and the transportation sector, would now face a dramatic shift in demand. The loss of the South as a trading partner would hurt Northern businesses, leading to widespread economic uncertainty. This financial disruption, combined with the North's newfound sense of failure, would fuel social unrest and political instability. On a deeper level, the North's identity crisis would also center around issues of race. Although slavery had been abolished in the Union states, the racial divide in the North was far from resolved. African Americans in the North, many of whom had fought for the Union, would now find themselves in a society where racial inequality persisted. With the South's continued reliance on racial subjugation, the North would confront the uncomfortable reality that its own racial policies were not so different from the South's, though the region had not formally embraced slavery. The question of how to truly integrate African Americans into society and the moral questions surrounding their status as free people would become central to the North's self-reflection. The crisis of Northern identity would be marked by a tension between national pride, economic challenges, and moral reckonings. The defeat would force the North to come to terms with its past, confront its ideological contradictions, and consider its place in a world where the United States was no longer united. As the Northern states navigated this crisis, they would have to grapple with the implications of a divided nation and seek a new sense of purpose in a world where the dream of a united America seemed increasingly distant. The North's struggle with its own nationalism. In the aftermath of the Confederacy's victory, the North would face an intense struggle with its own sense of nationalism. For much of the 19th century, the United States had been the beacon of democracy and unity, with the belief that the country's strength lay in its ability to preserve a singular national identity. This sense of shared purpose had driven the North to wage the Civil War, fighting to keep the Union intact and to end the institution of slavery. However, the South's successful secession shattered this vision, forcing the North to reevaluate its sense of national pride and unity. The North's struggle would center around the loss of its identity as the leader of a unified nation. With the Confederacy now an independent entity, the North would be forced to confront the fact that its vision of a unified America had failed. This realization would lead to an existential crisis for many in the North, as the ideals of American exceptionalism, which had been central to the national consciousness, no longer seemed to hold the same weight. What did it mean to be American now that the Union was fractured and the South had its own identity? The North would have to redefine what it meant to be part of the United States, especially in the absence of the moral and ideological authority it had once claimed. Economically, the North's sense of nationalism would also be tested. The war had been fought under the assumption that a united nation would bring prosperity, and Northern industries had thrived during the conflict. But with the South now separated, the North would face a host of economic challenges. The loss of the Southern cotton trade, along with the disruption of established markets, would severely impact Northern businesses. Many in the North had hoped that victory would bring a lasting economic boon, but instead, they would be confronted with a period of uncertainty and adjustment. The very economic system that had been used to justify the war now seemed fragile, calling into question the North's role in the global economy. Socially, the North would have to wrestle with the question of race and how to integrate African Americans into society. Although slavery was abolished in the Union states, the Northern states still had significant racial prejudice and segregation. The moral victories of the war would feel hollow for many African Americans who found themselves facing discrimination in the North. The struggle to reconcile ideals of freedom and equality with the reality of racial injustice would further challenge the North's national identity. Ultimately, the North's struggle with its own nationalism would be about reconciling the gap between its ideals and its reality. The defeat and the South's newfound independence would force the North to confront its contradictions and to ask difficult questions about what it meant to be a nation. This struggle would define the North's future, as it sought to rebuild its sense of identity in a world where the dream of a united America was no longer attainable. Industrial growth and political reorientation. In the wake of the Confederacy's victory and the collapse of the Union, the North would experience a period of intense industrial growth, although this economic expansion would be tempered by political reorientation. With the loss of the South and the resultant redefined geopolitical landscape, the North would have to reassess its role within a world that no longer saw the United States as a singular entity. This industrial growth, while initially seen as a sign of resilience, would be deeply intertwined with the shifting political priorities of a fractured nation. Economically, the North's industries would begin to adapt to the new reality of a divided country. The loss of Southern markets and resources would force the North to expand its trade relationships beyond the confines of the former United States. The North's industrial base, which had already grown significantly during the Civil War, would continue to expand as the demand for manufacturing increased. Northern factories, particularly those involved in railroads, textiles, and arms manufacturing, would turn their focus to new markets in Europe, seeking new customers for their goods and services. However, this economic shift would not come without challenges. The South's secession had disrupted existing trade routes, and Northern businesses would now have to navigate a more fragmented global market. The reorientation would require a rethinking of economic strategy, as the North would need to foster relationships with new trading partners, especially in Europe, while dealing with the loss of the once important Southern cotton trade. Politically, the North would be forced to confront its own identity in the wake of the Confederacy's success. The Union, once a symbol of a strong, united nation, now seemed like a relic of the past. The idea of American exceptionalism, which had driven the North's cause during the war, would be challenged as the Confederacy stood as an independent nation. Northern politicians would be left to grapple with what it meant to be part of a diminished Union. The political establishment would likely become more isolationist, focusing on securing domestic stability and redefining what it meant to be American in a divided world. Internally, political reorientation would involve a focus on preserving the North's economic and political influence, despite the loss of the South. Northern states would have to work together to maintain unity, but with a shift in focus to economic self-sufficiency and regional security. The end of the war would mark a period of intense political fragmentation as Northern leaders navigated the pressures of a divided country while attempting to secure the region's future as an industrial powerhouse. In this environment, the North's industrial growth would provide the foundation for future power, but it would also highlight the need for political stability and realignment in a world where national unity had been forever altered. Labor movements and civil rights reform. In the aftermath of the Confederacy's victory and the dissolution of the Union, the Northern states would experience significant shifts in both labor movements and civil rights reform. As the North's economy adjusted to the new geopolitical reality, with industrial expansion driving much of its growth, workers, particularly in urban areas, would begin to organize in response to growing economic inequality and the harsh realities of factory life. These labor movements, fueled by the rise of industry, would intersect with the evolving civil rights struggles in the North as African Americans, newly free, sought to secure their rights and status in a society that remained deeply divided. Labor movements in the North would become increasingly vocal and organized during this period. Factory workers, including a growing number of immigrant laborers, would face long hours, low wages, and dangerous working conditions in rapidly expanding industrial sectors. The rise of trade unions would become a response to these issues as workers began to demand better wages, safer working conditions, and reasonable working hours. However, the political landscape in the North would complicate these efforts. In a region still reeling from the loss of the Civil War and adjusting to the economic disruptions caused by the Confederacy's independence, labor movements would find themselves navigating a fraught political environment. Many Northern leaders, having invested heavily in industry to make up for the economic loss of the South, would be resistant to reforms that might disrupt business interests. The labor struggle would become an ongoing battle between industrial capitalists and working-class activists, with workers increasingly pushing for government intervention and legislation to protect their rights. Simultaneously, civil rights reform would also become a central issue for many in the North, particularly for African Americans who had fought for their freedom during the war. Though slavery had been abolished in the Union, racial inequality persisted in both the North and the newly formed Confederacy. In the wake of the war, African Americans in northern cities would seek greater legal protections, access to education, and the right to vote. However, the victory of the South in the war had led to a political shift in the North, where many white Northerners, disillusioned by the war's outcome, were less inclined to support full civil rights for African Americans. Racial prejudice, though less institutionalized than in the South, remained a potent force in the North, making progress on civil rights slow and contested. The intersections of labor movements and civil rights reform would reveal the complex realities of Northern society in this new world. Both movements, while distinct in their origins and objectives, would challenge the social order in ways that would reshape the North's political landscape. Labor activists and civil rights leaders would find common ground in their shared fight against inequality, but their battles would be uphill, complicated by the economic and racial divisions that continue to define the Northern states. This period of reform, though marked by setbacks and resistance, would lay the groundwork for future struggles for justice and equality in the United States. Chapter 9: International Ramifications. The Confederacy's victory and the subsequent division of the United States would have profound international ramifications, reshaping global geopolitics in ways that were previously unimaginable. With the Union defeated and the South emerging as a separate nation, the world's balance of power would shift, especially as European powers would now have to reconsider their relationships with the North and the newly formed Confederacy. This new world order would not only influence trade and diplomacy, but also alter the trajectory of global conflicts and international alliances. One of the most immediate effects would be the impact on European nations, particularly Britain and France, who had been keenly interested in the outcome of the American Civil War. The Confederacy, with its agricultural economy deeply rooted in cotton production, had long hoped to secure diplomatic and economic support from these nations. In the wake of its victory, the South would find itself engaged in diplomacy with European powers, seeking recognition as an independent nation. The Confederacy's ability to secure this recognition would shift the balance of power in Europe, as both Britain and France would be eager to expand their influence in the Americas. Their economic ties with the South, especially in terms of cotton exports, would create a new kind of geopolitical dependency. These relationships would be strategic for European powers looking to exploit the South's resources and use the new nation as a counterweight to the growing power of the United States, particularly in terms of trade routes and colonial competition. At the same time, the North would find itself isolated, struggling to retain its place in the global community. The North, once a dominant economic and military force, would now have to navigate a complex diplomatic environment. With the Confederacy gaining recognition and support from European powers, the North would face immense challenges in asserting its interests on the world stage. This geopolitical shift would likely result in a more isolationist and defensive approach from the North, focusing on securing its own stability and rebuilding its fractured economy. The Union would also be forced to reconsider its alliances and trade relationships, shifting its focus to other global powers and potentially forming new alliances to offset the rise of the Confederacy. The division of the United States would also reverberate in global conflicts, particularly in the context of European colonial ambitions. The South's new independence could serve as a model for other separatist movements around the world, inspiring similar efforts in Latin America, Asia, and even Europe. The consequences of a divided America would have long-term ramifications, particularly in the lead-up to the global tensions that would eventually culminate in the world wars. The presence of a divided North and South would influence military strategies and international relations, with each side seeking to align with global powers to secure their own interests. In the broader scope of international history, the Confederacy's victory would shift the direction of global politics, prompting new alliances, trade agreements, and military confrontations. It would redefine the global landscape for generations to come, with lasting consequences that stretched far beyond the borders of North America. European powers and their role in the Civil War's outcome. The involvement of European powers during the American Civil War was a pivotal factor in shaping its outcome, especially in the case of the Confederacy's hopes for foreign recognition. While European powers did not directly intervene in the conflict, their political and economic considerations were critical in determining the resources and legitimacy that both the Union and the Confederacy could access. This external influence would play an even greater role had the Confederacy emerged victorious. From the outset, the Confederacy sought recognition from European nations, particularly Britain and France. The South believed that its cotton production, vital to the global textile industry, would make it indispensable to European powers, especially in Britain, which had a robust textile industry reliant on Southern cotton. As the war progressed, the Confederacy tried to leverage this economic dependency, hoping that Britain or France would step in and formally recognize it as an independent nation. Such recognition would have provided the South with legitimacy on the international stage and the possibility of military support, which could have turned the tide of the war. Britain, in particular, played a complex role throughout the conflict. While it had strong economic ties to the South due to its reliance on cotton, it also had significant moral and political concerns regarding slavery. As the war wore on, and the Union increasingly framed its cause as one of emancipation, British public opinion swung in favor of the Union, making any formal recognition of the Confederacy politically difficult. However, despite this, Britain and France both remained neutral throughout the conflict, occasionally offering diplomatic support to the South through measures such as the construction of Confederate warships in British yards. These actions, though not equivalent to full intervention, were symbolic gestures that indicated a level of European sympathy for the Confederate cause. The Union, aware of the South's attempts to gain European recognition, sought to prevent any intervention by emphasizing its strategic importance to European powers. President Abraham Lincoln, recognizing the importance of maintaining European neutrality, made deliberate efforts to ensure that Britain and France would not intervene on behalf of the Confederacy. The Union worked tirelessly to ensure that no diplomatic breach occurred, even as it strategically withheld cotton shipments to Europe to try and force the European powers to lean toward supporting the Union. Had the Confederacy won the Civil War, the European powers would have undoubtedly played a more direct role in shaping its future. With a Confederate victory, Britain and France would likely have been more inclined to formally recognize the new nation, establishing diplomatic and trade relationships. This would have had significant implications for the future of the Americas, creating a much more divided hemisphere and potentially altering the global balance of power for decades to come. The involvement of European powers in the Civil War, though largely indirect, was a critical element in the outcome, and their role would have been magnified in a scenario where the Confederacy achieved independence. The spread of republicanism versus monarchies. The outcome of the American Civil War, especially if the Confederacy had won, would have had profound implications for the broader global ideological struggle between republicanism and monarchies. During the mid-19th century, republicanism, particularly as embodied by the United States and its democratic institutions, was seen as an alternative to the prevailing monarchical systems of Europe. The success of the Confederacy would have sparked significant ideological debates across Europe, especially in nations like Britain, France, and Spain, which had long been governed by monarchies or aristocratic elites. The rise of the Confederacy as a sovereign nation would have signified a major shift in the political landscape of the Western Hemisphere. It could have been viewed by European monarchies and aristocracies as an opportunity to strengthen the legitimacy of their own systems of government, particularly in countries that were grappling with internal unrest and revolutionary movements. The Confederacy's victory might have emboldened monarchies, giving them a new example of a successful breakaway republic founded on a system that, while outwardly republican, maintained aristocratic and land-owning privileges at its core. This could have encouraged monarchies to adopt more authoritarian, centralized policies to preserve their control, and possibly inspired other separatist movements within Europe's empires. However, the Confederacy's promotion of a hierarchical, racially stratified system built on slavery would have presented a paradox for Republican ideals. Despite presenting itself as a republic, the Confederacy's commitment to slavery contradicted many of the values of republicanism, which were built around liberty, equality, and the idea that all people should be able to participate in government. European Republicans and liberal intellectuals would likely have been divided, with some viewing the Confederacy as an ally in the fight against Northern republicanism, while others saw it as an affront to the principles of freedom and democracy. The intellectual and political battle within Europe could have led to an even greater polarization between Republican movements seeking equality and monarchies seeking to preserve hierarchical power structures. On the other hand, a Confederate victory could have influenced Republican movements by challenging the idea that democracy and republicanism were inherently incompatible with slavery and traditional social hierarchies. In this scenario, the Confederate model of governance could have been used as a rallying point for conservative forces in Europe, giving rise to a more reactionary form of republicanism that may have been less focused on universal human rights and more on regional autonomy and class divisions. Ultimately, the spread of republicanism versus monarchies would have continued to define political struggles across Europe and the Americas in the years following a Confederate victory. The ripple effects would have been felt in global revolutions, colonial uprisings, and ideological debates for decades, and the outcome of the Civil War would have forever altered the balance between these two competing political systems. Shifts in global trade routes and alliances. The outcome of the American Civil War, particularly if the Confederacy had emerged victorious, would have caused significant shifts in global trade routes and international alliances, reshaping the economic and political landscapes of the mid-19th century. With the Confederacy's independence, the geopolitical structure of the Western Hemisphere would change, and both established and emerging global powers would be forced to adjust their trade policies and diplomatic relations accordingly. One of the most immediate effects would be the transformation of trade routes, particularly those connected to cotton. The Confederacy, as a new independent nation, would seek to establish itself as a dominant global supplier of cotton, a critical raw material for the textile industries in Europe, particularly in Britain and France. With the Union no longer a threat, southern ports like Charleston, Savannah, and New Orleans would gain increased strategic importance. The Confederacy's ability to control and expand cotton production could lead to new maritime trade routes directly connecting southern ports with European markets, bypassing northern ports and disrupting traditional shipping lanes. This would intensify competition between European powers to secure favorable trade agreements with the new Confederacy, altering the flow of goods and resources across the Atlantic. The Confederacy's economic interests would also prompt it to establish new relationships with global markets. The South, deeply reliant on agriculture, would seek to solidify its position as a key player in the international marketplace, particularly in the global commodity trade. At the same time, Europe's demand for Southern cotton would push Britain and France to deepen their economic ties with the Confederacy, potentially establishing long-term trading alliances and mutual dependencies. In contrast, the Union would face economic isolation, no longer benefiting from the cotton trade and forced to redirect its focus on other markets or industries, particularly in the emerging industrial sectors. Diplomatically, the Confederacy's victory would create new power dynamics in the Western Hemisphere. European nations, eager to protect and expand their interests in the Americas, would likely shift their alliances to align with the Confederacy in an effort to counterbalance the remaining Union. France and Britain, particularly, would seek to exploit this new geopolitical reality, strengthening their hold on Latin American territories and possibly supporting other independence movements in the region to further undermine the Union's influence. In the Pacific, the Confederacy's victory could also prompt shifts in the way the United States and European powers interacted with China and Japan. As the Confederacy grew closer to European powers, it could align itself with them in global trade networks, challenging the Union's influence in Asia and increasing competition over access to key markets. The formation of new trade partnerships and alliances would result in a reorientation of the global economy, leading to shifts in economic dominance and regional power dynamics that would echo through the rest of the 19th century. Ultimately, a Confederate victory would reshape not only the political structure of the Americas, but also the international order, leading to new trade routes, diplomatic alliances, and economic alignments that would define global interactions for generations to come. Chapter 10, Slavery in the New World. Had the Confederacy been successful in the American Civil War, slavery's future would have been drastically different, not only within the borders of the southern states, but across the entire Western Hemisphere. The Confederacy, as a new nation built on the preservation and expansion of slavery, would have had a profound impact on the institution globally, especially in regions where slavery was already entrenched or where economic pressures could lead to its expansion. In the United States, slavery's existence in the Confederacy would be codified as the cornerstone of the Southern economy. The new Confederate government would likely have passed laws to further entrench the practice, perhaps even expanding slavery into new territories in the West. Given the Confederacy's reliance on cotton, rice, tobacco, and other plantation crops, the demand for enslaved labor would continue to drive the Southern economy, and the institution would become further entrenched. It's conceivable that the Confederacy, with its newly established political independence, would have pushed to expand slavery into other regions, especially in the Caribbean, Central America, and parts of South America where European powers had holdings. Internationally, slavery would remain a deeply divisive issue. European nations, many of which had abolished slavery by the mid-19th century, would have been put in a difficult position. Their economic relationships with the Confederacy, particularly over cotton, would force European nations to reconcile their economic interests with their anti-slavery moral positions. In Britain and France, where the abolition of slavery was already established, the relationship with the Confederacy would have created tensions, as these powers would have had to balance trade interests with their public anti-slavery stances. While they may have hesitated to fully endorse slavery, the economic dependence on cotton from the Confederacy could have led to reluctant acquiescence or even covert support for Southern interests. In the Caribbean, the success of the Confederacy could have inspired slaveholding societies to remain intact. Countries like Cuba, Brazil, and Puerto Rico, where slavery was still legal, might have drawn closer to the Confederate model, particularly if they saw the Confederacy as an economic powerhouse. The preservation of slavery would have undermined the abolitionist movements that were gaining momentum across the Americas. The success of the Confederacy would have emboldened pro-slavery factions in these regions, potentially staving off abolitionist efforts for years, if not decades. In the longer term, the international community's engagement with slavery would likely have become a growing point of tension. The Confederacy, driven by its dependence on enslaved labor, would have created a divide in the global political landscape, with the Americas split into two opposing spheres: a union fighting for a world without slavery, and a Confederacy aiming to expand and perpetuate it. The success of the Confederacy would have significantly delayed the worldwide abolition of slavery, creating a more prolonged and intense battle over human rights that would resonate across global political, economic, and moral debates for much longer than history eventually played out. The global endurance of slavery. Had the Confederacy won the Civil War, the persistence of slavery would have extended far beyond the borders of the Southern states, deeply influencing global attitudes toward human rights, labor systems, and colonial practices for decades. While many European nations had already abolished slavery by the mid-19th century, the survival and expansion of slavery in the Confederacy would have caused profound shifts in global geopolitics and economics, extending the life of the institution both in the Americas and other parts of the world. The Confederacy's victory would have solidified slavery as a central economic and social institution, pushing it further into the global spotlight. As the Confederate economy relied heavily on plantation crops, such as cotton, tobacco, and rice, it would have maintained and potentially expanded its use of enslaved labor. This would have had a direct impact on global markets, especially Europe, which was heavily dependent on Southern cotton for its textile industry. In this context, the Confederacy's success would not only perpetuate slavery in the South, but might have set the stage for its expansion to other parts of the New World, particularly in the Caribbean and Latin America. Slavery, which had already been abolished in many European countries, might have been indirectly supported through trade relations. European nations, although largely abolitionist by this point, might have been forced to accept the Confederacy's stance due to the economic reliance on Southern exports. The Confederacy's growing economic power would place pressure on nations like Britain, France, and Spain to reconcile their abolitionist policies with the reality of their dependence on slave-produced goods, particularly cotton. While moral opposition to slavery would have persisted in these countries, trade interests could have led to tacit support for the Confederate system, maintaining a global division over the practice. In regions like Cuba, Brazil, and Puerto Rico, where slavery was still entrenched, the success of the Confederacy would have emboldened pro-slavery movements. The Confederacy's victory might have encouraged these countries to preserve and even expand their own slave economies, delaying their eventual abolition movements. In these areas, slavery would have continued as an integral part of the labor force, supported by both local economic needs and international trade dynamics that favored slave-produced goods. The persistence of slavery in the Confederacy would also have delayed the global push for abolition. With the Confederacy acting as a powerful, successful slaveholding nation, other countries would have faced greater obstacles in implementing abolitionist policies. The idea of slavery's moral and economic viability would have remained a contentious global debate, prolonging its existence in other parts of the world, especially in regions where slavery was still economically beneficial. The global endurance of slavery would have continued as a divisive force in global politics, challenging moral and economic ideologies for years to come. Abolition movements in Europe and the Americas. The Confederacy's victory in the Civil War would have had far-reaching consequences for abolition movements in both Europe and the Americas. With slavery firmly entrenched in the South, the global abolitionist movement would have faced immense challenges. In regions where slavery had already been abolished, such as in much of Western Europe, the victory of a slaveholding nation like the Confederacy would have ignited a tense political and ideological struggle. The Confederacy, with its endorsement of slavery, would have created a stark contrast to the growing movement against human bondage in Europe, particularly in Britain and France. In Britain, where the abolition of slavery in the colonies had been a major achievement of the early 19th century, the Confederacy's success would have shaken the moral and political resolve of abolitionists. While the British government had abolished slavery throughout the empire in 1833, the economic importance of Southern cotton to Britain's textile industry created a complex dynamic. The Confederacy's victory might have prompted Britain to continue importing cotton from the South, thus indirectly supporting the continuation of slavery. This reliance on Southern cotton could have led to a more ambivalent stance on slavery, as the British government may have been reluctant to antagonize the Confederacy over moral grounds, fearing the economic consequences of cutting off trade. In France, the Confederacy's success would have similarly complicated the abolitionist cause. While slavery had been abolished in French colonies during the Revolution, the renewed political and economic relationship with the Confederacy could have led to a re-examination of abolitionist ideals. France, with its own historical ties to slavery in the Caribbean, might have been less eager to confront the Confederacy, especially if it stood as a powerful and independent economic partner. In the Americas, the Confederacy's survival would have had an even more direct impact on abolitionist movements. In nations like Cuba and Brazil, where slavery persisted, the Confederate victory could have provided a powerful model for slaveholding societies. It would have been seen as proof that slavery could survive and even thrive in a modern, independent state. As a result, the push for abolition in these countries would have faced fierce opposition, delaying or even preventing the eventual end of slavery. However, even in the face of the Confederacy's triumph, abolitionist movements would have continued to resist, though they would have been more fragmented. The moral and intellectual arguments against slavery would persist, but their effectiveness would be severely limited by the economic and political realities of global trade. The Confederacy's victory would have prolonged the existence of slavery and set back the abolitionist cause, but it would not have silenced it entirely. Across the Atlantic, in Europe and the Americas, activists would have continued their fight, albeit under far more difficult circumstances, challenging the persistence of slavery on a global scale. Slavery's changing role in the Confederacy. In the aftermath of the Confederacy's victory in the Civil War, slavery's role within Southern society would have undergone significant changes, reshaping the very fabric of the region's economy, politics, and social structure. While slavery would remain a central institution, its evolving role would be influenced by the demands of a growing global economy, changing international relationships, and the Confederacy's need to modernize in order to compete with the industrialized world. Initially, slavery would have continued to be the backbone of the Confederacy's agricultural economy, particularly in the production of crops like cotton, tobacco, and rice. The South's reliance on enslaved labor would have remained integral to its economic system, fueling exports to Europe and maintaining its position as a key player in the global market. However, the continued existence of slavery would not have meant a simple continuation of the pre-war status quo. With the Confederacy now an independent nation, the institution of slavery would have had to adapt to the political and economic pressures of a changing world. As industrialization began to take hold globally, the Confederacy would have faced growing pressure to modernize its economy. While the plantation system was still reliant on manual labor, technological advances in machinery and transportation would have begun to shift the dynamics of production. Slavery, while still central to the agricultural economy, might have been extended into new areas, such as the development of railroads and factories. This diversification could have led to a restructuring of how enslaved people were used, possibly expanding their role beyond the traditional agricultural sectors into more urbanized and industrialized settings. Internationally, the growing opposition to slavery in Europe would have forced the Confederacy to confront the moral and political ramifications of its system. European countries, particularly Britain and France, would have placed increasing pressure on the Confederacy to end the practice, especially as they continued to expand their own abolitionist policies. However, with the Confederacy's economic power firmly tied to slavery, it would have been resistant to such changes, viewing any potential abolition as a threat to its economic stability. In the Confederacy itself, as slavery persisted, there would have been a growing divide between pro-slavery elites and the rest of the population. Many in the South might have pushed for reforms that would have altered the conditions of enslavement, not in an effort to abolish it, but to better integrate it into a modern industrialized society. In time, this could have led to tensions over the future of slavery and its place in the Confederacy's national identity. Overall, while slavery would have remained a cornerstone of the Confederacy's society in the years following the Civil War, it would have been in a constant state of evolution, shaped by both internal needs and external pressures. The institution would not have disappeared, but its role in the economy and culture of the South would have continued to shift as the Confederacy navigated the complexities of the post-war world. Chapter 11: The Confederacy's Path to Expansion. Following its victory in the Civil War, the Confederacy would have turned its focus toward expansion, seeking to solidify its place in the global arena and secure its long-term survival. The Confederacy's desire for territorial growth, both within North America and beyond, would have been driven by a number of factors: the need for more resources, the desire for new markets, and a determination to spread its way of life to other parts of the continent and the world. The Confederacy's initial territorial expansion would likely have been focused on consolidating its hold over the southern United States and incorporating new territories to ensure economic and political dominance. Expansion westward into regions like Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona would have been a primary goal, as these areas offered valuable resources such as minerals, agricultural land, and access to the Pacific Ocean. Texas, already a part of the Confederacy following its secession, would have been a key strategic asset, both for its economic potential and its military significance in ensuring the Confederacy's defense. The Confederacy would also have to expand southward into Central America and the Caribbean, areas that were rich in natural resources and fertile lands suitable for the continuation of plantation-style agriculture. The Confederacy's pro-slavery stance would have led it to look for regions where slavery could be expanded and solidified. Countries like Cuba and Nicaragua, where slavery still existed or had economic potential, would have become prime targets for Confederate expansion efforts. A Confederate presence in these areas could have led to the establishment of client states or even direct annexation, as the Confederacy worked to extend its influence and control over the Western Hemisphere. On the international stage, the Confederacy's expansion would have been met with mixed reactions. European powers, particularly Britain and France, would have had to balance their economic interests in the region with their commitment to anti-slavery principles. The Confederacy's success would have complicated international relations, especially as European nations grappled with the implications of supporting or opposing a slave-holding nation's expansionist ambitions. In the Americas, the Confederacy's expansion would have challenged existing power dynamics, especially with the United States, which, although weakened by its defeat, would have remained a significant rival. Tensions would have increased as the two nations vied for influence and control over contested territories. This ongoing rivalry could have led to further conflict as the Confederacy pushed for territorial dominance while attempting to build a more secure and powerful nation. Ultimately, the Confederacy's path to expansion would have been a complex and multifaceted journey, involving both military and diplomatic efforts. Whether through annexation, diplomacy, or conflict, the Confederacy would have sought to secure its place in the world by extending its reach, ensuring its survival, and spreading its values of slavery, plantation economy, and Southern nationalism. Westward expansion and Native American displacement. The Confederacy's victory in the Civil War and its subsequent expansionist ambitions would have brought it into direct conflict with Native American tribes, leading to widespread displacement and conflict. Just as the United States in our timeline expanded westward, seeking to claim new territories, the Confederacy would have pursued similar goals, driven by the need for more agricultural land, resources, and access to critical trade routes. This process would have resulted in the further marginalization of Native American communities, whose territories were now seen as prime targets for expansion. The South's thirst for expansion, particularly into regions like Texas, Arizona, New Mexico, and even further into the Western territories, would have meant that Native American tribes in those areas would have been forced to contend with Confederate encroachment on their ancestral lands. For many tribes, these lands had been home for centuries, and the Confederate government's policies would likely have mirrored those of the United States in terms of forced relocations and treaties that often resulted in little more than land grabs. Like the Indian Removal Act of the 1830s, the Confederacy would have sought to push tribes onto reservations or into less fertile territories, all while justifying this action as part of their manifest destiny. The economic incentives behind the Confederacy's westward push were clear. New lands for agriculture, particularly for cotton, tobacco, and the expansion of the plantation economy, were crucial to the Confederate way of life. The acquisition of these lands would have required overcoming the resistance of native tribes, who saw these encroachments as existential threats to their way of life. In response, there would likely have been numerous violent confrontations between Confederate forces and Native American groups, including raids, massacres, and warfare. The Confederacy, in need of securing its newly acquired territories, would have implemented military campaigns to subdue these tribes, using force and intimidation to ensure compliance. Additionally, the Confederacy's need for new territory would have led to increased competition with Native American tribes for critical resources, including water and fertile lands. The demand for resources would have driven the Confederacy to forcibly push Native groups into areas that were either barren or not suitable for their traditional means of subsistence, exacerbating tensions. In the broader scope of American history, the Confederate pursuit of westward expansion would have added yet another chapter to the painful history of Native American displacement. The continued marginalization, the suppression of cultural identities, and the forced relocation of these tribes would have deepened the tragedy of Native American history, as the Confederacy sought to shape the West in its image of plantation agriculture and slavery. The process of westward expansion, just as in the United States, would have been marked by brutality, broken promises, and enduring trauma for the Native peoples who were caught in its path. The potential for a new Southern empire. In the aftermath of a Confederate victory in the Civil War, the South's ambition for regional dominance could have led to the creation of a new Southern empire, extending far beyond its original borders. The Confederacy, once solidified as an independent nation, would have seen its newfound autonomy as an opportunity to reimagine its geopolitical future. Fueled by a desire for economic prosperity, territorial expansion, and the preservation of slavery, the Confederacy could have sought to build an empire that stretched across the Americas. The first step in this vision of empire would have been the expansion of Confederate territory. With the defeat of the United States, the Confederacy would have set its sights on consolidating its control over the Western territories, pushing further into Mexico and the Caribbean. The annexation of lands rich in resources and agricultural potential would have been essential to the Confederacy's economic model, particularly its reliance on the cotton trade. Territories such as Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, and even parts of California could have been absorbed into the Confederate fold, providing new resources, labor, and land for expansion. Beyond the United States, the Confederacy might have sought to influence or directly control areas in the Caribbean, such as Cuba and Puerto Rico. These islands, with their rich sugar plantations, would have aligned with the Confederacy's economic interests, offering both valuable resources and opportunities to expand slavery. By supporting pro-slavery movements in these regions, the Confederacy could have positioned itself as a power broker in the Caribbean, using its economic influence to secure strategic alliances or even territorial acquisitions. The idea of a Southern empire would have been underpinned by a vision of a racially stratified society, with slavery continuing as an integral institution within the Confederacy and its new territories. The expansion of slavery would have been seen as crucial to maintaining the South's economic system, particularly as the Confederacy sought to increase its agricultural output to support its growing empire. This expansionist model would have created tension with European powers, particularly Great Britain and France, who had already abolished slavery and had their own colonial interests in the Caribbean and Latin America. In addition to territorial expansion, the Confederacy's vision of empire would have involved a cultural and political reorganization of the Americas. The South, as the self-proclaimed bastion of a pro-slavery society, would have worked to foster alliances with other slaveholding nations, presenting itself as the leader of a new political order. The Confederacy could have envisioned itself as an alternative to the growing influence of republicanism and abolitionism in the Western Hemisphere, positioning itself as a defender of monarchy and a slaveholding aristocratic society. In conclusion, the Confederacy's potential for building a new Southern empire rested on a foundation of territorial ambition, economic necessity, and the expansion of slavery. The creation of such an empire would have had profound and lasting implications for the future of the Americas, altering the course of history and shifting the balance of power in the region for decades to come. Tensions in Mexico and the Caribbean. Following the Confederacy's victory in the Civil War, its ambitions for territorial expansion would have brought it into direct conflict with both Mexico and Caribbean nations, intensifying tensions in these regions. The Confederacy's desire to extend its influence in the Western Hemisphere, particularly through the annexation of territories rich in resources or strategic value, would have inevitably led to diplomatic and military confrontations. Mexico, still reeling from its own internal conflicts, such as the Reform War and the French intervention that led to the establishment of a short-lived empire under Maximilian I, would have found itself facing a new threat in the form of the Confederacy. The Confederacy's expansionist goals would likely have led it to seek control over northern Mexican territories, particularly those rich in land and resources, such as Sonora and Baja California. The Confederacy could have attempted to exploit the political instability in Mexico to push for territorial acquisition, either through diplomatic means or, more likely, through military intervention. The Confederacy's interest in Mexico would have been driven by a desire to secure more agricultural land for its plantation economy, particularly for the cultivation of cotton, tobacco, and sugar. Additionally, access to ports along the Pacific coast would have been vital for expanding Confederate trade routes, particularly in competition with other global powers. A conflict with Mexico would have been a logical consequence of these expansionist ambitions, as Mexico, although weak, would have resisted losing its territory to a foreign power. Meanwhile, the Caribbean, with its colonial sugar plantations and strategic maritime positions, would have been another focal point for Confederate expansion. Nations such as Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Dominican Republic were of particular interest to the Confederacy, as they not only provided resources that were essential to the Southern economy, but also offered potential sites for the expansion of slavery. The Confederacy would have likely tried to foster pro-slavery movements in these areas, seeking to annex them or establish them as client states to further strengthen its economic and geopolitical position. However, the Confederacy's ambitions in the Caribbean would have been met with resistance from European powers, particularly Britain and France, which had already established strongholds in the region. These European nations, with their own colonial interests, would have been wary of Confederate expansion and might have sought to limit its influence, especially given the moral opposition to slavery in Europe. This tension would have created a complex diplomatic landscape, with the Confederacy navigating its ambitions while balancing relationships with European powers who were keen on maintaining their own dominance in the Caribbean. Ultimately, the Confederacy's expansion into Mexico and the Caribbean would have sparked conflicts and diplomatic crises that further complicated its rise as a global power. The region would have been marked by a series of political, military, and economic struggles as the Confederacy attempted to extend its reach while facing opposition both from its neighbors and from the international community. Chapter 12: The Long-Term Effects on American Culture. The victory of the Confederacy and its establishment as a separate nation would have left an indelible mark on American culture, shaping the future of both the North and South in ways that would echo for generations. In the aftermath of the Civil War, the cultural divide between the North and the South would have deepened, affecting everything from regional identity to political values and social norms. One of the most immediate and lasting effects would have been the preservation and expansion of slavery in the Confederacy. Slavery, as the cornerstone of the Southern economy and way of life, would have continued to influence Southern culture, reinforcing the rigid racial hierarchy that defined the region. The cultural legacy of slavery would have persisted for generations, embedding racial divisions more deeply into Southern society. The notion of white supremacy, which had already been central to the South's identity, would have become even more entrenched, shaping attitudes toward race, labor, and citizenship for years to come. In contrast, the North would have been forced to contend with its defeat and the ramifications of the Confederacy's success. Northern culture, which had been moving toward industrialization, abolitionism, and greater social mobility, would have experienced a cultural retrenchment. The loss of the Civil War would have led to a crisis of identity for the North, as it struggled to reconcile its values of democracy and freedom with the defeat of its cause. This could have sparked a period of cultural introspection as Northern states re-examined their role in the world and their commitment to the principles of liberty. The North's post-war trajectory might have led to increased focus on industrialization, but also a rise in labor movements and political upheaval as citizens grappled with economic changes and the shifting political landscape. On a broader scale, the Confederacy's victory would have shifted American cultural norms and attitudes toward governance and national identity. The idea of a unified nation might have been replaced with a new vision of competing national identities, as both the Confederacy and the Union, now potentially relegated to a smaller and less influential role, developed separate systems of governance. The cultural clash between republicanism and monarchy, democracy and aristocracy, would have been evident in the literature, art, and intellectual thought of both nations. Furthermore, the Confederacy's victory would have led to a prolonged period of global influence for the South, creating cultural and economic ties with other slaveholding nations. As the Confederacy sought to expand its empire and preserve slavery, its influence on global trade, politics, and culture would have shaped the world stage. European powers, particularly those in the Caribbean and Latin America, would have aligned themselves with the Confederacy, further affecting cultural exchange and the development of global attitudes toward race, slavery, and human rights. In conclusion, the long-term effects of a Confederate victory on American culture would have been profound, reinforcing regional divides and perpetuating a culture rooted in slavery and white supremacy in the South, while forcing the North to reassess its national identity and its values. This alternate history would have fostered deep cultural rifts that would last far beyond the Civil War itself, affecting generations to come. Diverging cultural identities between North and South. In the aftermath of a Confederate victory, the cultural identities of the North and South would have solidified into distinctly separate, competing entities, each with its own values, ideals, and social structures. These differences would not only manifest in political ideology, but also shape the way people lived, interacted, and thought across the two regions. In the South, the Confederacy's victory would have solidified the importance of a rural, agrarian lifestyle rooted in slavery. The Southern identity was built around a rigid social hierarchy that placed white, landowning elites at the top, followed by poor white farmers, and at the bottom, enslaved Black individuals. With slavery preserved as an integral part of the economy, the South's culture would have continued to center around plantation life, family dynasties, and an economy reliant on cotton and tobacco. Southern cultural pride would have become synonymous with maintaining these traditions, and a strong sense of regionalism would have persisted, with the Confederacy seeing itself as the defender of Southern heritage and values. Southern art, literature, and even religion would have reflected these social structures. Works of fiction and nonfiction would often focus on the honor and dignity of Southern aristocracy, the virtues of rural life, and the moral righteousness of slavery. Southern religious practices, too, would have been more conservative, aligning closely with evangelical Protestantism and reinforcing the region's traditional social order. This was a culture deeply intertwined with the preservation of slavery and the belief in white supremacy, a legacy that would have continued to shape the South for generations. In contrast, the North's identity, forged through its resistance to slavery and growing industrialization, would have taken on a more progressive, urban, and economically diverse character. Without the unifying force of the Civil War, the North would have been left to deal with the consequences of its defeat in a war it believed was righteous. Over time, however, the North would have shifted toward a more industrialized, capitalist economy. The rise of factories, railroads, and urban centers would have led to a society focused on work, innovation, and social mobility. Culturally, the North would have been a place of diversity and progressivism, with growing movements for labor rights, women's rights, and education reform. The North would have continued to lead in scientific advancements and become a hub for intellectual and social movements pushing for greater equality, albeit in a world now divided by the existence of a slaveholding South. As northern cities grew, so did their role as cultural epicenters, fostering artistic, literary, and political movements that challenged the status quo and called for a reimagining of what America could be, now that its unity was forever fractured. These diverging cultural identities would have led to a permanent division in American life, where the South, clinging to its agrarian and slaveholding past, would have continued to advocate for traditions that the North rejected in favor of a more industrial and progressive future. This stark contrast would have shaped the relationships between the two regions, fostering long-term animosity and a deeply divided cultural landscape across the nation. The legacy of civil rights and segregation. In a world where the Confederacy emerged victorious in the Civil War, the trajectory of civil rights and racial equality would have been vastly different from the path that unfolded after the Union's triumph. With the Confederacy maintaining its authority over the South, slavery would have endured for decades, and segregation would have been institutionalized as a fundamental aspect of Southern society. The legacy of this systemic inequality would have left lasting imprints on American culture, politics, and race relations. Under the Confederacy, the preservation of slavery meant that African Americans would have been denied freedom and basic rights in the South for an extended period. The institution of slavery, rather than being abolished by the 13th Amendment, would have been enshrined as the foundation of the Southern economy and way of life. Over time, this would have evolved into an entrenched racial hierarchy that placed white Southerners at the top and African Americans at the bottom. Racial segregation would have become more rigidly defined, permeating every aspect of daily life, from education and housing to employment and public services. The legal and social systems would have ensured that Black individuals remained subjugated, while white supremacy remained an unchallenged norm. In contrast, the North, having fought against the Confederacy, would have been left to confront its own complexities regarding race and civil rights. Although the Confederacy's victory would have delayed any broader national efforts to abolish slavery, the North's industrial, urban environment would have fostered a different kind of racial inequality. Segregation, though not as codified as in the South, would still persist in northern cities, as white communities would resist integrating Black populations. This complex relationship between race and region would have created deep divisions within the North itself, as abolitionist movements and civil rights advocates struggled against systemic discrimination. The international community's response to the Confederacy's triumph would have also influenced race relations in the U.S. The abolitionist movement that gained strength in Europe and the Americas would have continued to put pressure on the Confederacy, but the South's continued reliance on slavery would have left the country isolated from a growing global movement toward equality. The legacy of racial inequality would have created significant tension both within the U.S. and between it and the rest of the world. Ultimately, the legacy of civil rights and segregation in a world where the Confederacy won would have been one of deep-seated racial injustice. The path to racial equality would have been far longer and more fraught, as the South's commitment to preserving slavery and segregation would have shaped the nation's racial landscape for generations to come. The arts, literature, and a divided nation. In the aftermath of a Confederate victory, the cultural and artistic landscapes of the United States would have been irrevocably shaped by the deep divisions between North and South. The Civil War's outcome would have influenced how art and literature reflected the nation's identity, values, and the ongoing tensions over race, slavery, and nationalism. The arts, in all their forms, would have become a battleground for expressing differing worldviews, reinforcing regionalism, and challenging or upholding the prevailing societal structures. In the South, the arts would likely have been used as a tool to promote and glorify the Confederacy's ideals. Literature and visual arts would be deeply intertwined with themes of Southern honor, the defense of states' rights, and the preservation of slavery. Writers and poets, like those from the antebellum South, would continue to idealize plantation life and its purportedly harmonious relationship between masters and slaves. The institution of slavery would not just be defended politically, but romanticized in Southern literature, fostering a culture that viewed the Confederacy's struggle as one of noble sacrifice and righteousness. This narrative would serve to justify the continuation of racial hierarchies and segregation as integral to Southern society. Meanwhile, Northern art and literature would have taken a distinctly different approach. Writers and artists from the Union states would have been forced to confront the outcome of a war in which they were defeated. Their works could have reflected a sense of loss and trauma, but also a fierce resistance to the Confederate system. Literature in the North would likely focus on the ongoing struggle for civil rights, albeit in a more fragmented way than what actually unfolded after the Union's victory. Abolitionist themes would remain alive in Northern cultural circles, though they would be muted in comparison to the pre-war period, and civil rights would be a central focus in the efforts to reconcile the North with its ideals of liberty and equality. The cultural divide between North and South would also have affected broader movements in the arts. Nationally recognized literary figures, theater productions, and artists would be shaped by the conflict, with some attempting to bridge the gap between North and South while others deepen the divide. Over time, literature and art would increasingly reflect the tensions and struggles of a divided nation, where differing visions of identity, democracy, and justice clashed in the realm of cultural expression. In such a divided environment, the arts would serve as both a reflection of and a resistance to the larger forces at play in American society, amplifying the ideological divide that defined the nation for generations. Conclusion. The alternate history of the Confederacy's victory in the Civil War would have dramatically reshaped the course of American history and the development of global relations in the 19th and 20th centuries. The long-term impacts on both North and South, politically, economically, and culturally, would have set the stage for a world far different from what we know today. A victorious South would have solidified its control over the institution of slavery and expanded it into new territories, further entrenching racial hierarchies across the Southern landscape. Its economy, initially grounded in agricultural production reliant on enslaved labor, might have eventually diversified, but its social and political systems would have remained firmly tied to the preservation of that institution. The Confederate government's recognition by European powers would have bolstered its sense of legitimacy, while the United States, struggling with its own identity and nationalism, would have faced a long period of division and turmoil. In the North, the loss of the war would have led to a crisis of national identity. The defeat might have forced the United States to confront its own contradictions regarding freedom and equality, but the absence of the South's secession would likely have delayed or complicated efforts toward full civil rights for African Americans. Social movements focused on labor, women's rights, and abolitionism would still have emerged, but would have done so under more challenging circumstances. The North's industrial growth would have continued, but with its political and social fabric damaged by the war's outcome. Internationally, the Confederacy's success would have had profound effects on global trade and diplomacy. As the Confederacy aligned itself with European monarchies, it would have shifted the balance of global power, influencing colonial policies and the spread of republicanism versus monarchism. The Confederacy's potential expansion into Latin America and the Caribbean would have altered the dynamics of those regions, leading to conflicts that could have affected the entire hemisphere. In the end, the Confederacy's victory would have ensured that slavery endured longer than it did in our history, with deep, lasting repercussions for race relations both in the Americas and globally. Cultural expressions in both the North and South would have reflected the lasting scars of division, with the legacy of the Civil War continuing to shape American identity for generations. While the Confederate States of America might have flourished in some ways, it would never have been able to escape the moral, social, and economic weight of the institution it was built upon.